If you'd like to help support the channel, I'd greatly appreciate it. You can join the Patreon page, purchase something from the Teespring store, Etsy shop, and share the videos. It's your support that allows me to animate these battles. Thank you. The end of 1863 and into 1864 was a tumultuous time for both the Union and Confederate armies in the Eastern Theater. Commander of the Army of the Potomac, George Gordon Meade, was able to keep his army supplied well in northern Virginia. Railroads and waterways allowed supplies to pass into his lines, which boosted the morale of his army. Despite re-enlistments, his army was still depleted from the 1863 campaign season. 2 of his corps were detached for service in the West. He would combine the corps he still possessed into just 3. The 1st and 3rd Corps would be split up and divided amongst the other corps. What remained was the 2nd Corps under Winfield Scott Hancock, the 5th Corps under Governor K. Warren, and the 6th Corps under John Sedgwick. Soon the Army of the Potomac would be augmented by the return of the 9th Corps under Ambrose Burnside. That corps had been sent to Vicksburg, then took part in the East Tennessee campaign, before returning to the Eastern Theater and the Army of the Potomac. However, Burnside at one time commanded that army. By proper military hierarchy, he couldn't take orders from Meade, who was his junior in rank. That problem would be solved in the spring of 1864. Ulysses S. Grant, fresh off a string of victories at Vicksburg and Chattanooga, was promoted to lieutenant general, meaning he held rank over all commanders in the entire United States Army. Grant would make his headquarters with the Army of the Potomac. Burnside's 9th Corps would answer directly to Grant instead of Meade. When Grant came to Meade's headquarters, Meade feared that Grant would relieve him of command, and even told the new general-in-chief that if he felt the need to replace him, to not hesitate. Grant calmed the general's anxiety by stating that he didn't plan on replacing the army commander. However, Grant did replace his cavalry commander, Alfred Pleasonton. The cavalryman performed poorly and many were dissatisfied with his actions, so Grant removed him and replaced him with Philip Sheridan, whom Grant had known in the Western Theater. Robert E. Lee and his Army of Northern Virginia was suffering that winter for a want of supplies, unlike their Union counterparts. Pleas to Richmond for food and equipment went unfulfilled. Lee's army had been depleted by illness, battles, and sending units to other theaters. James Longstreet and his 1st Corps had been sent west and helped Braxton Bragg win the Battle of Chickamauga, before clashing with Bragg and being sent to attack Burnside in East Tennessee. Longstreet failed to dislodge the Union forces around Knoxville and would return to Lee on April 20, 1864. Lee now had his 3 corps together, the 1st under Longstreet, the 2nd Corps under Richard S. Ewell, and the 3rd Corps under A.P. Hill, amounting to a little over 60,000 men. Grant possessed twice the number of Lee, and now that spring was beginning, Grant began to plan for the upcoming campaign. He and his friend William T. Sherman in northern Georgia would launch simultaneous attacks in May 1864, Sherman against Atlanta and Grant against Lee toward Richmond. In the Eastern Theater, Grant had 2 options. He could try to outflank Lee to the west, but it would be more difficult to supply his army going that route. If he assailed Lee's right flank, he could supply his army using railroads and waterways that crisscrossed the landscape. Easily he chose that route. The Rapidan River separated the 2 armies, and from atop Clark's Mountain, Lee and his corps commanders, Longstreet, Ewell, and Hill, overlooked the landscape below. Lee concluded that Grant would move against his right, and that when Grant moved, they would move. On the night of May 3rd, Grant and the Army of the Potomac began their movement against Lee's right flank, the 2nd Corps moving toward the crossing at Ely's Ford, and the 5th and 6th Corps at Germanna Ford. The 9th Corps was to wait on the north side of the Rapidan until called for by Grant. That night, Lee could see the flickering of the fires that indicated soldiers marching in front of the flames. Knowing that Grant was on the move, he now needed to know how many men were involved and where they were headed. He alerted Ewell and Hill to have their men prepared to march by morning. Reports soon came in that the Army of the Potomac was headed for Ely's and Germanna Fords. Leaving Richard Anderson's division of Hill's Corps and a few other units from Ewell's Corps to guard the original line, Lee ordered Hill and Ewell to the east, hoping to engage with Grant in the thick forest of the wilderness, where his numbers and superior artillery would mean less. Grant hoped to make it out of the wilderness and into the open to engage with Lee on more advantageous ground for himself. By the night of May 4th, Hancock's 2nd Corps encamped at Chancellorsville, and the other 2 corps encamped between Germanna Ford and the crossroads made by the Germanna Plank Road and the Orange Turnpike. Ewell's corps encamped on the Orange Turnpike and Hill's on the Orange Plank Road. Longstreet's corps had been called up by Lee, but it would be some time before he caught up to the other 2 corps. On the morning of May 5th, the 2 armies moved closer to one another. Philip Sheridan, the commander of Grant's cavalry, depleted the front of horsemen because he didn't want to disperse his men, plus he wanted to concentrate his forces against Confederate cavalry near Fredericksburg. This left James Wilson's cavalry division as the only force scouting ahead of the Union movement. Worse yet, Wilson hadn't sent any of his troops along the Orange Turnpike ahead of Governor K. Warren's 5th Corps. Ewell's Confederate infantry, led by Edward Allegheny Johnson's division, screened by North Carolina cavalry, made contact with part of Warren's corps, troops under the divisional commander of Charles Griffin. Warren informed Meade of the encounter, and Meade ordered a push against the entire line, hoping to buy some time for the rest of the army to come up. While Ewell was marching east along the Orange Turnpike and digging in around Saunders Field, Hill's corps was marching in the same direction on the Orange Plank Road. The only thing standing in his way was a small cavalry force left there by Wilson. Hill's lead division under Henry Heath threw out William Kirkland's brigade to drive back the Union horsemen. The fight was particularly bloody because the cavalrymen were armed with Spencer repeating carbines, which put up a steady fire into the slow-moving battle line of Kirkland. The 5th New York Cavalry lost and then regained Parker's Store, a vital road junction, before Crawford's division approached the junction. However, they didn't attack. They instead found good ground and waited. At the same time, part of Wilson's cavalry under Colonel George H. Chapman engaged with Confederate cavalry under Brigadier General Thomas L. Rosser. The cavalry battle raged with the Gray troops launching a couple of charges, but were ultimately driven back. Within Warren's corps, chaos was reigning. He was attempting to follow Meade's orders, but his divisions were not properly aligned. Griffin, Wadsworth, and Crawford had large gaps between their lines, and Warren wanted them filled. So he ordered Crawford to move to the right to connect with Wadsworth's left, but Crawford, hearing heavy gunfire to his front, didn't want to risk the movement. Griffin at Saunders Field was ordered to move against the Confederate position, but didn't want to attack across the open field. Before the movement across the Rapidan, Grant pledged to Meade that the Pennsylvanian would fight the campaign in his own way. However, Grant became restless as he expected fighting to occur, but nothing was materializing. At least nothing to any significant degree. He began to ride along the roads over which the Union Army marched, and found Ricketts' division of Sedgwick's 6th Corps by the Rapidan River. Here he broke his pledge and ordered Ricketts to the front, not aware that Meade had ordered Ricketts to guard the right flank. Grant also ordered Horatio Wright's division to the Orange Turnpike. Feeling that that area was now going to be secure, Grant and Meade turned their attention toward the Orange Plank Road. Hill's troops were heading east, and his lead division under Henry Heath pushed the Union cavalry toward the intersection of the Orange Plank Road and the Brock Road, another vital location. Grant and Meade took the last division of Sedgwick's corps under George Getty and sent it in that direction. The stage was now set for one of the largest battles of the American Civil War, the Battle of the Wilderness. By 11:30 a.m. on May 5th, Getty's division made it to the crossroads of the Brock Road and the Orange Plank Road, blocking Heath's division from gaining the vital location. Ulysses S. Grant and George Meade were becoming increasingly frustrated, particularly with Governor K. Warren's lack of aggression. Warren was called to Meade's headquarters, where Meade criticized him for not moving his corps forward and attacking Lee when ordered to do so. After the meeting, Warren told General Griffin's aide in harsh words to move that division forward at once. It was now noon, and Griffin was finally able to move his division out from behind the breastworks that the men threw up to protect themselves from rebel bullets. At about 1 o'clock, the Union regiments made it to the jumping-off point. The brigades of Romaine Ayres and Joseph Bartlett sent their first line of men forward toward the enemy. Halfway across Saunders Field, the volleys from the Virginians and North Carolinians ripped into their lines. Seeing the problems the first line was having, the second line was thrown in to give them support, but their flanks were unsecure. Miraculously, many of the regiments on the front lines were making it across the field, amid the hail of gunfire. When Leroy Stafford's Louisianians and Walker's Virginians fired deadly volleys into the flank of the U.S. regulars, it crumbled, leaving the 140th New York out front, awaiting the second line. Naturally, it gravitated to the left to connect with Bartlett's men. When Ayres' second line got into the field, the same destructive fire that eliminated scores of U.S. regulars did the same thing to the two Pennsylvania regiments. When they left, this only left the 140th and 146th New York regiments north of the Orange Turnpike. The Virginians were holding steady, but to the south the Iron Brigade, led by Lysander Cutler from Wadsworth's division, was coming to Griffin's rescue. The 7th Indiana from the Iron Brigade hit John M. Jones's flank, and it began to crumble under the weight of the attack. Each regiment began to fall like dominoes. As some of the Virginians passed Cullen Battle's Alabama Brigade, some Alabamians asked, "Is the whole army retreating?" A Virginian said, "Yes, we are all falling back to Mine Run. The whole army is." This was enough to send the 5th and 3rd Alabama headed to the rear with the Virginians. Now the Union regiments had a foothold on the Confederate line, but could they hold it? The dense forest and thickets prevented them from seeing the enemy, but the light resistance indicated that the Confederates were fleeing in their front. However, the attack had thrown each regiment into confusion as men lost contact with their units. As they moved forward like a large mob, they came into contact with John B. Gordon's Georgians, who had recently arrived at the location. On the Orange Turnpike, Ewell was attempting to hold his line together. He grabbed a flag, planted it on the turnpike, and yelled to an orderly to tell General Gordon to bring up his brigade. The Federal soldiers retreated back across Saunders Field. A battery of artillery remained on the turnpike in the middle of the field. The 3rd and 1st North Carolina advanced to lay claim to the prize, but Federal bullets erupted from the tree line. The Tar Heels couldn't stay out in the open long before they retreated. Before they left, they placed small flags on the cannons to tempt the Union regiments. It worked. The 9th Massachusetts advanced into the field to claim the guns, but the rebel bullets ripped into their ranks, producing 150 casualties in just a few minutes. The Bay Staters returned to their lines. The first attacks made by Griffin's division of Warren's 5th Corps ended in utter defeat, even though they initially gained some success. To the south, Wadsworth's division was attacking 2 brigades of Robert Rodes's division. The thick forest prevented either side from seeing the other. Men aimed at the smoke discharged from the rifled muskets. The Iron Brigade was working around the flank of Dole's Georgians, but Dole's men were holding steady, the trees giving them some shield against the Federal bullets. As it looked as though the Georgians were beginning to break, Gordon, whom Ewell had requested to move forward, advanced and hit the Iron Brigade, driving them east. The Georgians gave the famous rebel yell as they advanced through the thick forests of the wilderness. Gordon then split his brigade to deal with multiple threats. Parke continued east, pushing the retreating Midwesterners. The others moved south to help Daniel's brigade push back what was left of Rice's brigade. Samuel Crawford, the division commander whom Warren couldn't get to close up on Wadsworth's left flank, finally moved some troops in that direction. 3 regiments from McCandless's brigade of Pennsylvania Reserves made it to the field late. They cautiously moved through the thick underbrush that characterized the wilderness until they got to Higginson's field. Part of Gordon's Georgia Brigade advanced across the field with the 61st Georgia hitting the flank of the partial Union Brigade. Hundreds of the 7th Pennsylvania Reserve were taken prisoners in this quick movement. The rest, along with the 11th and 2nd Pennsylvania Reserves, retreated in haste from the field. Warren's attack in the beginning stages of the Battle of the Wilderness had resulted in complete failure. General Griffin, outraged at the lack of support and the fact that he was ordered to make such a senseless attack, came to Meade's headquarters, finding Grant, Meade, and Grant's Adjutant General, John Rawlins, there. Griffin let loose a tirade, asking where his support was, and why he was asked to sacrifice his division in such a way. Grant and Rawlins were appalled at Griffin's comments. Rawlins suggested that Griffin be arrested. Grant agreed by saying, "Who is this General Gregg? You ought to arrest him." Meade had known Griffin for some time and replied to Grant, "It's not Gregg, but Griffin, and it's only his way of talking," and assured both Grant and Rawlins that Griffin was indeed a good soldier. When Grant leaned back and lit up a cigar, Griffin left the scene. So far, Lee's line had held on, but more attacks were about to be made. The battle had just begun, but so far, the Confederates had the advantage. The Union Army of the Potomac, although defeated in the fight around Saunders Field, reformed fairly quickly despite the heavy losses. Those casualties still in the fields and in the forests of the wilderness came under a new threat. The blast from the rifled muskets and cannons set fire to the forest. The wounded who could walk tried to make it to the safety of their lines, but those unable to move faced the horrific fate of burning alive. Worse yet, the men's cartridge boxes, full of black powder and lead, would set off explosions when caught in the flames, adding further injuries to the wounded. One soldier described the scene. The almost cheerful pop-pop of the cartridge boxes gave no hint of the dreadful horror their noise bespoke. Swept by the flames, the trees, bushes, and logs which Confederates had thrown up as breastworks now took fire, and dense clouds of smoke rolled across the clearing, choking unfortunates who were exposed to it, and greatly hindered the work of the rescuers. The clearing now became a raging inferno in which many of the wounded perished. The bodies of the dead were blackened and burned beyond all possibility of recognition. It was a tragic conclusion to this day of horror. But the day wasn't over yet. More fighting would be done amidst the flames in the wilderness. Near Saunders Field, the brigades of Horatio Wright formed up to deliver their own attack against the Confederate left flank. Colonel Emory Upton, on Wright's left flank, went to his corps commander, John Sedgwick, and his division commander, Wright, to inform them both that attacking across the open field in his front would be disastrous. Both agreed, and when the attack commenced, Upton would stay put as the brigades to his right advanced. It was about 3 p.m. when Wright's men stepped off. The thick underbrush, dense smoke from the fires, and charred remains of comrades made the journey difficult. Before they made contact with Edward Johnson's Confederates, the brigades of Leroy Stafford and James A. Walker came out of their entrenchments and attacked. The wilderness hid the Union regiments until a volley erupted, catching the right side of Walker's line by surprise. The 5th and 27th Virginia fell back, forcing the 4th Virginia to pull their line back to protect the flank of the comrades to the left. However, this exposed the left flank of Stafford's Louisianians. With gunfire hitting their flanks and the Virginians beginning to disengage with the strong Federal line, Stafford had no choice but to withdraw. The small 1st Louisiana rallied around Stafford as the brigade commander assured that all of his regiments left the field. He sent the 1st back with their comrades and turned to ride back to his lines when a bullet entered beneath his left armpit and severed his spine. Some of his soldiers brought him back to their lines and laid him against a tree, paralyzed from the shot. As he lay there, the 9th Louisiana, his old regiment, part of Hayes' brigade of Louisiana Tigers, marched past. One soldier recalled, "We passed poor Stafford lying under a tree on the side of the road, suffering terribly from his wound." To those who stopped to express their sympathy, he spoke encouragingly, urging them to fight to the last and expressing a perfect willingness to yield up his life for the glorious cause in which he had so long borne arms. Stafford would be brought to Richmond, linger for 3 days, then pass away. President Davis and the First Lady attended the funeral. Hayes and his brigade arrived on the field, poised to halt the Union attack. What he didn't know was that the Federal line had stalled out already, many of the regiments running out of ammunition. Not knowing this, Hayes was going to launch a counterstrike to stop the Union advance. The Stonewall Brigade under Walker was to go with him, but when the Virginians didn't move, Hayes sent a message to Walker reminding him of his orders. Walker promised to advance as well, but when Hayes moved out, Walker's men did not accompany them. The Louisianians found the Federal battle line that overlapped their own. They stood toe-to-toe with the enemy and exchanged gunfire until the bullets hitting their flanks caused them to waver and retreat back to the safety of the Confederate breastworks. One Union soldier recalled that when the Louisianians retreated, within minutes he could hear the clanging of bayonets and tin cups against rocks as the Southerners dug trenches to protect themselves. The crack of axes in trees and the crash of the trees hitting the ground signaled to the blue-coated soldiers that the enemy wasn't giving up. They were strengthening their position against another possible attack. One soldier described it best when he wrote, "The battle had raged furiously along the entire line. The rattle of musketry would swell into a full continuous roar as the simultaneous discharge of 10,000 guns mingled in one grand concert, and then after a few minutes become more interrupted. We would hear the wild yells which always told of a rebel charge, and again the volleys would become more terrible, and the broken, crashing tones would swell into one continuous roll of sound, which presently would be interrupted by the vigorously manly cheers of the Northern soldiers, so different from the shrill yell of the rebels, and which indicated a repulse of their enemies. Now and then the monotony of the muskets was broken by a few discharges of artillery, which seemed to come in as a double bass in this concert of death. But so impenetrable was the forest that little use was made of artillery, and the work of destruction was carried on by the rifle. In the headquarters of Meade and Grant, the differing command styles were trying on both Grant and Meade, as well as their subordinates. Grant wanted to push Lee with what troops he had on hand, while Meade preferred to wait until his forces were concentrated before launching any attack. Earlier in the day, Grant had ordered Ricketts' division of Sedgwick's 6th Corps forward. Meade, before Grant's order, had ordered that division to guard the Army's right flank. In the confusion, Brigadier General James Ricketts did neither. It would be 4 p.m. before he would eventually go to the battlefield, and when he did, his division was split up, with one of his brigades under Brigadier General Truman Seymour going to the right flank to extend and reinforce the line there. Meade believed that now, with 2 of his corps ready on the right flank, that he could crush Ewell on the Orange Turnpike. This belief was reinforced when word came from a signal station that troops were seen leaving Ewell's lines and going to the Orange Plank Road, where General A.P. Hill and his corps were engaging with Winfield Scott Hancock's 2nd Corps. In reality, the troops moving in that direction were soldiers in Major General Cadmus Wilcox's division of Hill's own corps, simply going to reinforce his fellow division commander. The last year had been miserable for Truman Seymour. He had ordered the fateful charge of the 54th Massachusetts on Battery Wagner outside of Charleston, South Carolina, and he had been soundly defeated at the Battle of Olustee in Florida. Now he was back in the Army of the Potomac, not having been in that army since the Battle of Antietam. Now he occupied the far right of the Union Army at the Battle of the Wilderness. Sedgwick hoped to find Ewell's left flank and turn it with his entire corps, along with Warren's 5th Corps. When Seymour's brigade stepped off, no other brigade followed. Why none of the other brigades joined in the attack was unclear, and the men in Seymour's brigade were scared of what was ahead of them when they realized they were alone in this endeavor. Seymour was in the second line while Colonel J. Warren Kiefer commanded the front line. Kiefer halted his men outside the range of the rebels' rifled muskets and sent a messenger to Seymour informing him that they were alone in the attack and that the enemy overlapped both flanks. Word came back to Kiefer that he was to attack as ordered. Hoping that his original message hadn't got to Seymour, Kiefer waited. Then another message came, stating again, to attack as ordered. They attacked and confirmed what they already knew. Seymour's brigade hadn't attacked Ewell's flank. Gunfire rang out from all around the Federal brigade. Bullets whizzed by the poor men's heads and struck comrades all along the line. When the first line faded back, the second line took its place. It didn't fare any better. The Virginians of Brigadier General John Pegram and Hayes's Louisianians were well protected behind log breastworks and taking little damage, but causing horrendous damage to the Ohioans and Pennsylvanians. That line melted away too, leaving a layer of blue soldiers covering the ground. Kiefer was shot in the arm, but would survive. Pegram, riding behind his men and encouraging them, was shot in the leg and likewise would survive the wound. A Virginian remembered the horrors of the battle and the night that followed. Shall that terrible night ever be erased from my memory, the terrible groans of the wounded, the mournful sound of the owl and the awful shrill shrieks of the whippoorwill, the most hideous of all noises I ever heard on a battlefield after firing had ceased. The loneliness is of itself sufficient, and these birds seem to mock at our grief and laugh at the groans of the dying. Pen and words fail to describe the scene. So far, numerous attacks against Ewell's line had ended in failure. However, as attacks were made at Saunders Field, the corps of A.P. Hill was engaging with the corps of Winfield Scott Hancock over the intersection of the Brock and Orange Plank Road. Confederate General Robert E. Lee, Corps Commander A.P. Hill, and Confederate Cavalry Commander Jeb Stewart sat on their horses at the Widowtap Farm and discussed the developing engagement. With Richard S. Ewell being heavily engaged on the Confederate left, Lee knew that if his troops could get a hold of the intersection of the Orange Plank Road and the Brock Road, he could swing around and be in the rear of Ulysses S. Grant's army, forcing him to either turn his attention away from the Orange Turnpike or to retreat. Grant and George Meade sent the division of George Getty to that location to safeguard their flank and ordered Winfield Scott Hancock to hurry to that location to support Getty. Getty knew he needed a little more time before Hancock's corps would be ready to make their attack, so he attempted to delay Hill's corps. Getty assembled the 3 brigades he had immediately on hand, those under Frank Wheaton, Lewis Grant, and Henry Eustis, and sent them forward through the thick vegetation of the wilderness. South of the Orange Plank Road, Grant reported little to no resistance. Very few Confederate troops were south of the road, at least initially. North of the road, Cook and Stone's Confederate brigades threw out a strong skirmish line, but it was significantly lacking south of their position. Grant's troops, particularly the 3rd Vermont, were spread out before the harsh terrain. Confederate General Henry Heath recognized the lack of troops on his right and moved the brigade of Henry Walker, containing Tennesseans, Virginians, and Alabamians, to that sector. Walker's men did more than take up a position on Cook's right. They charged the men from Vermont, driving them back. As with many units in this battle, the approaches of the enemy were concealed, and the sudden appearance of such a large group of Confederates caused confusion in the ranks. After they drove Grant back, Walker formed his men on the right of Cook's line. They instantly began to dig in and throw up breastworks, anticipating a counterattack. As Grant's brigade was thrown back, the other 2 Union brigades stood 50 yards from their Confederate counterparts and fired volleys. One officer recalled, "The men aimed at the wall of fire and smoke in our front. The distance between the 2 lines was so short that under ordinary conditions we could have charged upon the enemy with the bayonet before given time to reload. But a bayonet charge under these conditions was nearly impossible. A line could advance only slowly and with great difficulty even when unopposed. Anything like a dash upon the enemy was simply out of the question. Many of Getty's men were laying down to load and fire at the rebels. To stand up courted death. As ammunition became depleted, Wheaton replaced his front line with his second line, but despite the added fresh troops and full cartridge boxes, the Confederates weren't budging from their position. On the Union right, Eustis's 2nd Rhode Island crumbled under the weight of the enemy flanking fire. It retreated and began to reform behind the lines. Eustis now moved the 7th and 37th Massachusetts into the front lines. This new batch of soldiers laid down on the ground and kept up a steady fire, hoping that reinforcements would be coming soon. Union gunners brought up a section of artillery and unlimbered it on the road. They threw canister, solid shot, and case shot into the rebel lines. Quickly, a single Confederate gun approached the rebel line on the same road, but from the opposite direction. Each artillery crew began to fire canister at one another, causing death and destruction to the crews and horses. Many of the Union horses were killed in the duel, but they drove off the rebel gun. After the artillery duel ended, a stalemate emerged as neither side was given in. Brigadier General John R. Cook's brigade attempted to gain an advantage and advanced against Wheaton's troops. The rebels captured the guns sitting on the Orange Plank Road, but after a momentary success, the Federal regiments quickly recaptured the guns and the stalemate resumed. Hancock got word from Meade that he wanted the 2nd Corps to reinforce both of Getty's flanks and keep the rest of the corps in reserve. The developing engagement challenged Hancock's ability to follow orders, but he would endeavor to support Getty the way Meade had intended. First, he sent part of John Hobart Ward's brigade to the left of Grant's line. Grant, a capable brigade commander, asked the commander of the 5th Vermont if he could take the Confederate position in his front, since it appeared weak. The commander of the 5th thought for a moment and said, "I think we can." He then asked the 2 regiments from Ward's brigade, the 20th Indiana and 40th New York, if they would join. They all declared that they would take the position. The 3 regiments charged and hit Walker's line, caving in part of it and capturing the flag of the 55th Virginia. However, the Federal regiments got pushed back by the rest of Walker's regiments. Because of the Confederate line overlapping Getty's entire line, he needed additional support on the right. The engagement that started between the divisions of Henry Heath and George Getty was now gathering more troops toward the intersection. Hancock ordered the brigades of Alexander Hayes, Robert McAllister, and William Brewster to prepare to advance. 2 of Hancock's divisions were forming for an attack. Likewise, Heath extended his line to the right with the 11th North Carolina from William Kirkland's brigade. 2 Union brigades on the Confederate right were now poised to slam into Heath's line at a near perpendicular angle. What happened next has never fully been explained or understood by the participants or historians. Mott's division rushed forward, stamping over and through the dense underbrush, and made contact with Heath's line. However, as determined as they marched, the battle line gave way in a domino effect once they hit the Confederate battle line. One officer believed that since a large portion of the soldiers' enlistments were up in a month, many didn't want to die so close to getting out of the army. Some of the men claimed that Confederate forces were hitting their flank and rear, so that could mean that part of the 11th North Carolina had been dispatched to hit the flank, but it couldn't have been a huge amount of men. Either way, the brigades retreated across the Brock Road, securing themselves behind the hastily thrown together breastworks that they had completed before being ordered into the fight. However, the rest of Ward's brigade and Hayes's brigade were approaching Heath's line. The 1st U.S. Sharpshooters, also known as Berdan's Sharpshooters, were the skirmish line for Hay's brigade. As they and Ward approached the Confederate line, a destructive volley rang out from the rebel breastworks. One New Yorker remembered, "The woods light up with the flashes of musketry, as if with lightning, while the incessant roar of the volleys sound like the crashing of thunderbolts." A member of the 3rd Michigan recalled, "The slaughter is fearful, men fall on every side, and my flag is receiving its share of bullets. Charge after charge is made by each side. Sometimes we drive the enemy, and then they rally and drive us, until both sides are exhausted, and night puts an end to our first day's struggle." Another soldier commented, "Brave men are falling like autumn leaves, and death holds high carnival in our ranks." Members of the 63rd Pennsylvania were laying down, obviously shaken by the horrific engagement. Hayes rode over to his old regiment to give them encouragement when a bullet struck his temple. His troops would carry him behind the lines in a blanket, and he would die a few hours later. His brigade would be taken over by John Crocker. Ward's men swung to attack Walker's men south of the Orange Plank Road and bolstered Grant's tired but tenacious troops. Heath would now commit the rest of Kirkland's brigade, sending them to various points in his line that he deemed weak, or to replace regiments who were out of ammunition. The 1 division under Heath had battled against elements of 3 different divisions and were holding on and even launching counterattacks. Part of Wheaton's brigade was forced to fall back for lack of ammunition, so the battle line that Hancock came to support needed to be patched. Hancock ordered John Gibbon to bring his division up at the double quick and ready them for an advance. Hancock was having to feed his men in piecemeal, but that's all he could do. If he hadn't, the Confederates could have overwhelmed Getty early in the engagement. He couldn't wait until all of his men were up before attacking. With the situation becoming critical for Heath's men, Hill and Lee dispatched 2 brigades from Cadmus Wilcox's division to Heath's front. Before they left, at the Tuning Farm, the brigades of Samuel McGowan and Alfred Scales were led in prayer by the chaplains. One soldier remembered, "On the left thundered the dull battle. On the right the sharp crack of rifles gradually swelled to equal importance. Above was the blue, placid heavens. Around us a varied landscape of forest and fields, green with the earliest foliage of spring, and here knelt hirsute and brown veterans striving for another struggle with death." The movement of Wilcox's men was discovered by the Union signal station, and Meade and Grant sent orders for Wadsworth's division to attack the Confederate left on the north side of the Orange Plank Road. Back in that sector, Grant and Wheaton's brigade had fired some of their last shots and needed rest and refitted. Hancock formed Samuel Carroll and Joshua Owens' brigades on either side of the Plank Road so they could replace the 2 tired brigades on the front line. As Grant pulled his right 2 regiments back so they could be replaced, Walker's Virginians charged their position, and Grant fell back. At this same time, the brigades of Scales and McGowan were ready to replace the weary troops of Heath. When Carroll and Owen attacked, so did Scales and McGowan, with the fresh rebel brigades advancing over the breastworks of Heath's men. Cook and Kirkland retreated to regroup and get resupplied with ammunition. Both sides battled in this lush terrain until the Confederates settled back into the breastworks prepared by their comrades. Stone on the left of Heath's line hadn't been relieved yet, but it needed to be soon. Many of his men fixed bayonets because they had no ammunition. Many of the Mississippians hoped that it wouldn't come to defending themselves with the bayonet, but they were prepared to do so if ordered. Luckily for them, Edward Thomas's Georgians would replace the beleaguered brigade. Hancock was a little cautious in the wilderness because he couldn't see the enemy's line or know its strength. Plus, it was difficult to attack the flanks because of the dense underbrush and swampy terrain. Nevertheless, he was attempting to overlap the enemy's flanks. A.P. Hill informed James Lane, whose North Carolinians were about to take up a position on the Confederate right, that Scales's men had become too disorganized in the attack and needed to fall back to reform, so Lane was to take their spot. Lane did as he was told. His men attacked the approaching 2 brigades under Nelson Miles and Thomas Smith. As he engaged with the approaching Federals, Wilcox pulled McGowan away from the front line to reform in the rear. This exposed Lane's brigade to flanking fire. Add on to that, John R. Brooks' brigade to the south had sent the 64th and 66th New York north to attack the Confederate flank. Lane was now by himself and surrounded by Union brigades. The only thing that saved Lane's men was the fact that they had thrown up some stiff resistance, and darkness began to cover the battlefield. In the darkness, Wadsworth's division approached from the north. Hill only had 1 unit available to combat this division, the 5th Alabama Battalion. Hill ordered the Alabamians to advance, screaming at the top of their lungs. When they did, the darkness and the sounds of shrieking rebel yells coming from that darkness halted Wadsworth's division. He had already been bloodied at Hickerson's Field, and the men stopped in their tracks. An historian of the battle summarized the fighting on Hill's front on May 5th succinctly when he wrote, A.P. Hill's battle farther south, however, was one of the war's most brilliant defensive efforts. There, the 7,000 men of Heath's division fought to a standstill a similarly sized 6th Corps division, Getty, followed by one assault after another from General Hancock's 2nd Corps, altogether some 30,000 men. Darkness covered the battlefield and gave the soldiers a few hours of respite after a horrific day of fighting. However, the army commanders were planning for the next day's actions. A North Carolinian from Hill's Corps described the first day's fight as such. A butchery pure and simple it was, unrelieved by any of the arts of war in which the exercise of military skill and tact robs the hour of some of its horrors. It was a mere slugging match in a dense thicket of small growth, where men but a few yards apart fired through the brushwood for hours, ceasing only when exhaustion and night commanded a rest. A man from Lewis Grant's Vermont Brigade wrote, "Oh, you have no idea of the scenes we are passing through. Tongue can never tell the suffering, the hardships, the alternate rising of hope and falling of hope. The successes of the battle are various, though we have made steady gain from the first, which if our men last, will give us the victory in the end." Ulysses S. Grant sat at his headquarters that night and said, "I feel pretty well satisfied with the result of the engagement, for it is evident that Lee attempted by a bold movement to strike this army in flank before it could be put into line of battle, and be prepared to fight to advantage. But in this he has failed." However, Grant realized that James Longstreet's corps for Lee and Ambrose Burnside's corps for himself had not made it to the field. With fresh troops coming to the side of the fighting, more bloodshed would happen the next day. Grant's strategy was for Winfield Scott Hancock and his 2nd Corps, along with Getty's division from the 6th Corps, to attack A.P. Hill's corps and drive it back, defeating it before Longstreet could make it to the field. The 5th and 6th Corps under Governor K. Warren and John Sedgwick would hold Ewell in place so that Robert E. Lee couldn't shift troops to Hill's front. Hancock's attack was initially scheduled for 4:30 a.m., but Meade and some other generals convinced Grant to extend the time in order for Burnside to make it to the field. Burnside's corps was one of the key components for the fighting on May 6th. The 9th Corps would take up a position in the Union center, with one division being sent to Hancock to be used as a reserve. Lee put forward his plan for the night and the next day. Hill would move his corps north to link up with Ewell, while Longstreet came up and took the place of Heath and Wilcox's division. But Hill didn't prepare his men for the next day, just in case Hancock renewed the attacks. Why remains uncertain. If Hill did fill out a report, it has been lost. Heath's account remains the only good source on the situation, but his is suspect because it appears his intention was solely to absolve himself of blame. Heath claimed that he and Wilcox approached Hill to ask that their lines be reformed. Hill waved it off and said reforming in darkness so close to the enemy's lines was dangerous, and leaving the area meant leaving the wounded, so they should stay where they were. Hill added, "Longstreet will be up in a few hours. He will form in your front. I don't propose that your division will do any fighting tomorrow. The men have been marching and fighting all day and are tired. I do not wish them disturbed." Allegedly, Heath came to Hill 3 times requesting to reform the lines, and on the last one, Hill angrily stated, "Heath, I don't want to hear any more about it. I don't want them disturbed." In that respect, Hill was just following Lee's orders for his men to rest until Longstreet arrived to relieve them. Heath also made a ridiculous claim that he spent 2 hours searching for General Lee to go over Hill's head and claimed he could not find the army commander. The reason for this ridiculousness was Lee's headquarters sat right behind Heath's division, and Lee was in his tent all night, so Heath's story remains highly suspect. Ewell on the Confederate left was more active in aligning his troops from the day's fight. He switched brigades around and filled gaps in the line where needed. Although numerous Union brigades attacked his front, for the most part his line held and he threw back any blue troops. He also massed his artillery around Saunders Field and on each flank, where they could be used most effectively. Around 5 a.m. on the Union right, heavy skirmishing erupted between the forces north of Saunders Field, but no major attacks were made. The Union commander, George Meade, wanted Warren to make a vigorous attack against the Confederate line on the Orange Turnpike to prevent reinforcements to be sent from Ewell's line to Hill's, but Warren wouldn't budge. His skirmishers did move out, but no substantial attack was made. As Warren delayed, Burnside's corps was marching to the Union center. Hancock, hearing that Burnside was delayed in getting to him due to fires and clogged roads, grew angry, but was going to press on with his orders anyway. Hancock had worked tirelessly through the night to construct a battle line that was deep rather than wide. That way, proper support would be given to the front line. Wadsworth's division, with Henry Baxter's brigade of Robinson's division, was also on Hill's left flank, and poised for an attack as well. At a little after 5 a.m., the signal gun went off, signaling for Hancock's men to advance. The blue-coated soldiers pushed on through the dense vegetation toward the enemy. Many of the bushes and small trees had been cut down to around 2.5 feet due to the gunfire from the previous day, so the men moved through with a little more ease than the day before. When they made contact with the rebels, the enemy fired one volley and then began to break. Skell's brigade was one of the few intact brigades that gave any resistance, but with so many others around them falling back, they wouldn't engage with the Federals long. It wasn't long before Hill's 2 divisions were in full retreat toward the Widowtap Field. The only thing standing in the way of Hancock's 2nd Corps was the success that led to regiments, brigades, and divisions becoming entangled, especially the front line, and the 16 artillery pieces assembled in the Tap Field by William Pogue. Pogue remembered, "Closer and closer the uproar came, and I directed our men to pile up rails, logs, etc., at each gun for protection from bullets that now came constantly our way." The Federal soldiers caught up to many of the fleeing rebels and yelled for them to come behind their lines. They held their fire until those who wanted to surrender made it safely behind the battle line. A staff officer from General Meade came to Hancock at the intersection of the Orange Plank Road and the Brock Road. Hancock was overjoyed. He said, "Tell General Meade we are driving them beautifully. Birney has gone in, and he has just cleaned them out beautifully." The staffer informed Hancock, "I was ordered to report only 1 division of Burnside up, but he would attack as soon as he could." Hancock replied, "I knew it, just what I expected. If he could attack now, we could smash A.P. Hill all to pieces." Although Hancock's troops met with great success against Hill's men, his battle lines were now intermingled. One of his aides described the situation. Great gaps appeared in the line. Men and even officers had lost their regiments in the jungle. The advance had not been, could not have been, made uniformly right to left, and the line of battle ran here forward and there backward through the forest. Thousands had fallen in the furious struggle. The men in front were largely out of ammunition. One of those Federal soldiers said, "We had to break up into squads and march by the flank. Regiments would thus become separated from brigades and brigades from divisions, and when the attempt was made to reestablish a line, numerous gaps existed." Hill tried mostly in vain to get soldiers to reform. It was no use. By this point, no cohesiveness existed. Hill directed Pogue to fire double canister over the heads of the retreating Confederates at the Union troops pushing through the tree line. His staff worried that the artillery might hit wounded soldiers on the ground, but Hill simply stated, "The guns must open fire." Hill, the former artilleryman he was, began helping to load and fire the pieces at the Federal soldiers. Lee himself tried to rally Hill's troops retreating through the Widowtap Field. He came to General McGowan and said, "My God, General McGowan, is this splendid brigade of yours running like a flock of geese?" McGowan responded, "General, the men are not whipped. They only want a place to form, and will fight as well as they ever did." Union troops were now showing themselves through the trees. The artillery was keeping them at bay, but it wouldn't be long before the blue lines began coming in waves to overrun the 16 Confederate cannons. Lee was now incredibly worried. He told Cadmus Wilcox, one of Hill's division commanders, to ride along the Orange Plank Road, that Longstreet must be here. Go bring him up. It wasn't long after Lee sent Wilcox on his mission that he saw a group of men in formation heading east along the Plank Road. Lee asked, "Who are you, my boys?" The reply came, "Texas boys." Hood's old Texas Brigade, now under Brigadier General John Gregg, was now on the field. Lee took off his hat, waved it in the air, and yelled, "Hurrah for Texas! Hurrah for Texas!" The Texans deployed for battle in the Widowtap Field, with Lee close at hand. When the new arrival saw their army commander so close, they told him, "Go back, General Lee, go back." When Lee continued to follow them, they began to say, "We won't go unless you go back." Lee's aide, Charles Venable, made his appearance and informed the commander that Longstreet was needing orders. Lee turned his trusted horse Traveler around and rode to Longstreet. an Alabamian in William F. Perry's brigade, which was 2 brigades behind Gregg's Texans, described the scene. Directly in our front, as we were hastening forward, the sun, blood red from the effect of the smoke of battle, was just appearing above the wilderness. Litter bearers were continually passing with the severely maimed, and a stream of wounded, able to leave the battle line, filled both sides of the plank road. I never before or after witnessed such excitement and confusion. It was perfectly appalling. Staff officers were urging their mounts at topmost speed back and forth. Orders were repeatedly received for us to quicken our steps. The number of wounded and stragglers increased as we drew nearer the firing line, all stating that we were holding our own, unwilling to acknowledge that disaster had befallen them. Despite Lee seeing and interacting with the Texans first, the first brigade to reach the field was Joseph Kershaw's old brigade of South Carolinians, now under John Kennedy. They would file to the right of the Orange Plank Road. The Texans and South Carolinians advanced against the confused ranks of the successful Union regiments. Gregg's men stood 20 yards away from the enemy, with both sides firing volleys into one another. After only a short time, Gregg's brigade dwindled from around 800 men to just 250, losing nearly 2/3 of his command. They fell back, but another brigade, that under Henry Benning, was right behind to take their place. On the right, Kennedy's line drifted south, opening up a gap in the line. Joseph Kershaw, the division commander, would fill it with Benjamin Humphreys' Mississippians. Even though the Union lines were a confused mass, they were still able to defend themselves excellently. Their bullets found their marks, indicated by the fact that both Benning and Kennedy were wounded in the action, with John Hennigan taking over Kennedy's brigade and Dudley DuBose took over the command of the Georgians. The openness of the ground led the Union bullets, finding more targets in the Georgians' ranks. Behind DuBose was the brigade of William Perry, full of Alabamians. He had time to form up his brigade properly before setting off. General Lee, watching as the Confederates dressed their lines in preparation for the assault, commented, "God bless the Alabamians." When Benning pulled back, Perry's men went in with a rebel yell, pushing back more Union soldiers. Before he stepped off, Perry was told to keep his right on the Orange Plank Road and keep it there. If not, a large gap would form and threaten both Field and Kershaw's divisions. Perry did so, but they began to take fire from the woods to their left. If something wasn't done, then they would have to fall back too, just like Gregg and Benning. So Perry dispatched the 15th Alabama into the woods to hit the Union soldiers in the flank. Those Union soldiers to be subject to the flanking fire were 2 heavy artillery units, turned into infantry because of a need for more troops. The brigade made up of the 15th and 6th New York Heavy Artillery were huge compared to other units on the field. With just 2 regiments, the brigade outnumbered Perry's 5-regiment brigade 2-1. The 450 men in the 15th Alabama under William C. Oates charged the large regiments, causing them to scatter. The blue soldiers were inexperienced, mostly seeing guard duty around the defenses of Washington, D.C. The veteran Alabamians dealt with them quickly, losing only 1 man killed and 11 wounded. Along the road, the 4th and 47th Alabama ran into the single regiment of the 37th Massachusetts. The rest of the brigade, commanded by Eustis, halted, but the Bay Staters didn't get the order and advanced anyway. The blue soldiers fell back since they were alone and their flanks got overlapped by the rebel regiments. However, 3 regiments of Carroll's brigade attacked the Alabamians, driving them back to some breastworks thrown up by E.P. Hill's men the previous day. Carroll's men were now too far ahead of their own lines, and a quick counterstrike by Perry's men sent the Bluecoats back into the wilderness. To Perry's left, the 3 regiments on that flank were encountering stiff resistance. Oates again took the 15th Alabama to the flank of Wadsworth's brigades and fired repeated volleys into their flank. The gunfire was too much for the men, and the division began to give way. South of the road, Bryan, Hennigan, and Humphreys' brigades were advancing slowly, but pushing the Federals away from their sector. But Lewis Grant's Vermont brigade held on, even with their flanks pulling back. Some comrades across the road fired into the flank of Humphreys, which prevented them from being completely surrounded. Webb's brigade had emerged from the Brock Road, ordered to that sector, but couldn't find the units they were supposed to support. They ran into Perry's brigade and were sent back before they did any major fighting. A lull finally covered the battlefield as each side threw up breastworks. General Lee's army had been saved by Longstreet's corps making it to the field and throwing back the Federal attack on the Plank Road. However, the day was young. It was just a little after 8 o'clock, and there would be more fighting to do. Winfield Scott Hancock's attack in the early morning of May 6th met with initial success, but when Longstreet arrived, many of his brigades were thrown back. Some of the units were badly bloodied and needed to be replaced. One of Ambrose Burnside's 9th Corps divisions arrived to give Hancock support, that under Brigadier General Thomas Stevenson. Hancock now became worried about his own left flank because more of Longstreet's brigades were arriving as time ticked away. Hancock began assembling a defensive line on the Brock Road to defend his position when Longstreet continued to press his front. To stabilize his front line, Hancock sent the brigade of Sumner Caruth of Stevenson's division to the front. Hearing gunfire to his south, he feared that Longstreet may be moving further south and attempting to turn his flank, so he dispatched Daniel Leisure's brigade down the Brock Road to Todd Tavern. What he actually heard was an engagement between Confederate Cavalry Commander Jeb Stewart and Union Cavalry Commander Philip Sheridan. Colonel Paul Frank's New York Brigade was also sent to the front, to the south of the Orange Plank Road. Frank and Robert McAllister didn't care for one another, and when Frank informed McAllister that he was going to move through his men to attack the Confederates in their front, McAllister refused to allow them through. When Frank attempted to go around McAllister, he ran into the brigade of Goodbrine and his Georgians. The New Yorkers, alone on the front lines, quickly retreated before the gray-clad enemy. Longstreet was gaining reinforcements all morning. Behind Charles Field and Joseph Kershaw's divisions was the 3rd and final division of A.P. Hill's corps, that under Richard Anderson. General Robert E. Lee's chief engineer, Martin L. Smith, reconnoitered the Federal left flank to see if any advantage could be found. He came back with word that an unfinished railroad cut belonging to the Fredericksburg and Gordonsville Railroad would give Longstreet's troops a perfect avenue along which he could move his men and strike the Federal flank. Longstreet chose his chief of staff, Moxley Sorrell, to lead the attack. Sorrell would command George Anderson's brigade of Field's division, William Wofford's brigade of Kershaw's division, and William Mahone's brigade of Anderson's division in this endeavor. Sorrell remembered that Longstreet said to him, "Colonel, there's a fine chance of a great attack by our right. If you will quickly get into those woods, some brigades will be found much scattered from the fight. Collect them and take charge, form a good line, and then move your right push forward and turn it as much as possible to the left. Hit hard when you start, and don't start until you have everything ready. I shall be waiting for your gunfire, and be on hand with fresh troops for further advance." Sorrell rode away from the meeting, feeling that no greater opportunity could be given to an aspiring young staff officer, and I was quickly at work. The brigades of Anderson, Mahone, and Wofford were lined up in fair order and in touch with each other. It was difficult to assemble them in that horrid wilderness, but in an hour we were ready. The brigades filed off into the railroad cut, poised to hit the flank of the Union brigades forming Hancock's front line. Sorrell got in front of the 12th Virginia, took off his hat, and waved it above his head, saying, "Follow me, Virginians. Let me lead you." A member of the 12th Virginia remembered, "The gallantry of this officer on that occasion is as vivid to me now as if it had been but yesterday. I do not remember to have seen during the whole period of the war a finer exhibition of prowess than I witnessed that day in Colonel Sorrell in the Battle of the Wilderness." Sorrell's men let out the rebel yell and slammed into the flank of Hancock's front line. McAllister had spotted the Confederates but couldn't get word fast enough to all the Union units before the attack came. At the same time, the rest of the brigades of Kershaw and Field were pushing forward. Some brigades attempted to turn and thwart the attack, but the bullets hit in their flank from all different angles. It was hard to keep the men's spirits high and keep a cohesive battle line. One soldier remembered that he and his comrades were obliged to run to the right of the line as the rebels came in on our left flank. The ground was covered with the dead and wounded in indescribable confusion. Another soldier wrote, "My leg saved me. We had to leave our dead and wounded, retreat out of that place, leaving all that we had gained in the hands of the enemy." North of the road, Wadsworth and Getty attempted to hold off the Confederates advancing in their front. The 20th Massachusetts was sent forward to hopefully blunt the rebel attack, but the concealed Confederates let loose an unsuspecting volley, which drove the Bay Staters back. Sorrell's attack force was pushing toward the Plank Road, which put the Union brigades on the north side of the road in a dilemma. Being hit from two sides, they decided to fall back to regroup on the Brock Road. The 12th Virginia of Mahone's brigade crossed the Plank Road and realized they were now separated from their brigade. It turned back toward the road, marching toward their fellow regiments. The dense forest obscured who they were to the rest of Mahone's regiments. Unsure of who was approaching them, the rebels south of the road began to fire on their comrades. at the same time that General Longstreet and his staff were riding down the road. It wounded and killed many in the party, including Longstreet, lifting him off the saddle and bringing him down hard. He was taken to the rear with a worried Robert E. Lee looking on. One Union soldier recalled the scene when Longstreet's troops slammed into them. My regiment was caught up as by a whirlwind and broken to fragments, and the terrible tempest of disaster swept on down the Union line, beating back brigade after brigade, and tearing to pieces regiment after regiment, until upwards of 20,000 veterans were fleeing, every man for himself, through the disorganizing and already blood-stained woods, toward the Union rear. Hancock would comment to Longstreet after the war, "You rolled me up like a wet blanket." Lee was now on the field to assess the situation. The rebel brigades were disorganized and needed to reform, so he called off going on the offensive at the moment, but did move his men forward to be ready to strike Hancock's line. Some of the last to leave the Winnowtap field were the brigades of Abner Perrin, William Perry, and Edward Perry. As they moved through the wilderness, they began to encounter Union troops on their left. Not expecting this, confusion went through the ranks, particularly William Perry's brigade. He sent the 48th and 15th Alabama regiments to investigate. The troops in that sector were two brigades from Burnside's corps, Potter's division. Ulysses S. Grant had been pressuring Burnside all morning to assist Hancock, and now, at a little after 1 o'clock, Burnside's troops were now hitting the flank of Longstreet's line. William Perry soon realized that there were more Federals than could be dealt with by his two regiments, and fronted the entire brigade northward. The Alabamians threw up breastworks the best they could. A Pennsylvanian wrote, "The movement was made through a dense wood, almost impenetrable owing to the entangled underbrush. The attack was made where it was utterly impossible to see anything from the thickness of the woods. The enemy was posted on the opposite side of a swampy ravine, behind entrenchments." One of his comrades recalled that those entrenchments or breastworks were made up of felled trees and the bodies of their dead. Edward Perry's Floridians faced north as well to confront the Yankees. The Florida Brigade numbered roughly 500 men, and when Zanus Bliss's brigade struck their line, it caved in. At about the same time, the 15th and 44th Alabama attempted to counterattack Bliss's right flank, but the tired Southerners couldn't budge the blue troops. William Perry's Alabamians held up against the fresh troops, but some Union soldiers were making their way into the Confederate breastworks. Reinforcements needed to come quickly. Burnside observed the engagement and ordered Griffin's brigade in, as well as Hartranft. Griffin's men joined Bliss's troops, with some of the more disheartened of Bliss's soldiers falling back. The rebel brigades of Dudley DuBose, John Stone, and Nathaniel Harris were also coming to reinforce their comrades. A Union soldier remembered, "Sharp firing at very close range ensued, followed by a savage charge which brought the boys into the enemy's rifle pits in some places. Being unable to maintain the advantage gained, the troops fell back. Twice the charge was renewed, considerable ground was gained, but the enemy retained possession of their lines. When Perry's brigade couldn't stand any more, their comrades reinforced their line as they pulled back. The two sides battled over the breastworks thrown up by the Alabamians. A member of the 36th Massachusetts remembered, "The regiment was loath to give up the great advantage it had gained, and the fighting was hand-to-hand, terrible and bloody. The men fought gallantly, but the force upon our left was too strong, and our line was compelled to retire, falling back slowly, with their faces toward the enemy. Finally, Burnside was able to stabilize his line, but with both sides exhausted and running low on ammunition, the battle drifted into a lull on Burnside's front. To the west, Longstreet's troops would soon attack Hancock's men assembled on the Brock Road. The appearance of Longstreet at the Winnowtap Field had saved Lee's Army of Northern Virginia that day and pushed Hancock's troops back to their stepping-off point on the Brock Road. Lee's strategy of keeping Grant and Meade in the wilderness to nullify their superiority in numbers had worked incredibly well so far by limiting the movements of Union forces and concealing his own movements. Winfield Scott Hancock had nearly one half of the entire Union Army of the Potomac under his command on the Union left, entrenched on the Brock Road, prepared to throw back any attempt by Longstreet's corps to take the intersection. Hancock's defensive line was a patchwork of sorts, and although it was deep, it was not organized enough to launch an attack or counterattack. It was around 4 p.m., and although the Battle of the Wilderness began around Saunders Field, most of the action had taken place on the Union left. One of General George Meade's staffers reconnoitered the Union front in that sector for the Army commander, and concluded that the front was clear of Confederates. The staffer couldn't have been more wrong. The dense foliage concealed at least 8 Confederate brigades waiting on word to move forward. To see what was in his front, Hancock dispatched Daniel Leisure's brigade to the front, beyond the secure entrenchments of the Brock Road. When the Union regiments sallied forth, the rebel brigades made themselves known to Leisure, but no major action would occur between the lone Union brigade and the front-line Confederates. Leisure returned to the entrenchments and informed Hancock that there were definitely enemy troops in their front. It wasn't long after Leisure returned to the Union lines that the Confederate brigades attacked Hancock's line. Although the 2nd Corps historian who was present at the battle believed it was an aggressive attack, he didn't believe it was an overwhelming one. However, the men on the front line for the 2nd Corps believed otherwise. One Union soldier described the attack as impetuous and persistent, the most wicked assault thus far encountered, brief in duration, but terrific in power and superhuman momentum. A member of the 1st Massachusetts recalled, "The enemy's first line, broken and wavering under the galling and repeated discharges of the Union infantry, was strengthened and steadied by the 2nd, and this again by the 3rd, both sides loading and firing in furious haste, till the rattle of at least 50,000 muskets rose into an incessant roll and roar, and all the space between the combatants was swept by a perfect hurricane of death-dealing missiles. The enemy was losing fearfully, and the Union troops behind their earthworks slightly." The attack mostly came from south of the Orange Plank Road, from the brigades of John Bratton, formerly Micah Jenkins's brigade, and George Anderson's brigade. The weight of the Confederate attack became too much, and the Union line broke, with the Georgians and South Carolinians surging into the breach, where hand-to-hand fighting began to erupt. Flames leapt from the pile of logs that formed the breastworks, and chaos began to run rampant through both ranks. Robert E. Lee had split Hancock's line in the center, near the intersection of the Orange Plank Road and the Brock Road, but the lack of support and the fact that Hancock quickly began to rally his men doomed this initial success. Leisure's men fixed bayonets and charged into the breach with their commander yelling, "Now, boys, show them what the anchor and cross cannon mean," referring to the Corps badge for the 9th Corps. Brooks' brigade came out of the line and hit the Confederates from the south, further weakening the hold that the Georgians had on the entrenchments. Finally, Carroll's brigade swept around and slammed into the flank of the South Carolinians. A member of Carroll's brigade remembered, "General Carroll made us a fiery speech and led us on the enemy. In a very short while we hustled them out of their position, taking a good many prisoners." With Union regiments converging on all sides, the 2 Confederate brigades pulled back, unable to capitalize on their initial success. The other brigades on the Confederate front lines made attacks, but none the size, scale, or success of Anderson and Bratton's attacks. After those initial attacks were pushed back, the fighting died down on the Union left, as both sides reorganized and collected their dead and wounded. May 6 was a busy time for a brigade commander in Jubal Early's division of Ewell's 2nd Corps. The young brigade commander was John Brown Gordon. Especially at Gettysburg, but even in the battles previous to that one, Gordon's reputation as a trusted and aggressive commander was touted throughout the Army of Northern Virginia. On the morning of May 6, Gordon sent out 2 scouting parties and personally reconnoitered the ground in front of him. He found that no Federals were in his front. Learning this valuable information, he believed that if he could put an attack force perpendicular to the Union line, he could sweep down the Federal ranks and roll up the entire Union right flank. As he said, as each of Sedgwick's brigades gave way in confusion, the corresponding Confederate brigade, whose front was thus cleared on the general line, was to swing into column of attack on the flank, thus swelling at each step of our advance the numbers, power, and momentum of the Confederate forces as they swept down the line of works and extend another brigade's length to the unprotected Union rear. Gordon sent an aide to find Jubal Early, his division commander, but instead found his corps commander, Richard Ewell. Soon Early arrived and heard the aide tell of Gordon's plan. Early shook his head and said that the last reports indicated that there were troops on the Germanna Plank Road, and even if the attack was launched, there was no reserves in case the Union troops counterattacked. The aide informed Gordon of Early's comments, and Gordon became enraged that Early dismissed his plan. Gordon personally had rode behind Union Corps Commander John Sedgwick's line and saw that no Federals were in that sector. Gordon personally rode to Ewell and pleaded his case, but it was dismissed again. At 1 p.m., Gordon again went to Ewell, but his case was denied again. After 2 p.m., Gordon received word that he should prepare for his planned attack. According to Gordon, General Ewell spoke to General Lee, and Lee authorized it, but the details are still unclear. Gordon was to use his brigade and the newly arrived brigade of Robert Johnston, full of North Carolinians. Gordon and Johnston were supposed to form a 2-brigade-long battle line, but instead of going to Gordon's left, Johnston remained behind Gordon. It was after 5 p.m. before all the units were ready. Ewell also wanted the attack to come at sunset to cause more disorder in the Union ranks and to magnify the amount of troops in the 2 brigades. It was around 6 p.m. when Gordon's men crashed into the Union flank. One Georgian remembered, "We found them massed 5 or 6 lines deep, all resting, cooking, and eating, with their guns stacked, their blankets spread down, and some of their little tents stretched." Another remembered, suddenly and only a few feet away, a long line of gray-clad soldiers appeared and opened on them. Never was lightning from the clouds more expected, and confusion reigned supreme. A New Yorker on that flank remembered, "The enemy came up suddenly with a terrific yell and jumped over and around the shallow works in front, throwing this gallant regiment into a rout before the members had time to grasp their muskets from the stacks." The 122nd New York made one of the most determined stands of the assault, but they, like all the rest, fell back amid the hail of gunfire coming from their flank. One Union officer described the scene. "Such excitement you could form no idea of. Staff officers yelling and calling on men to rally, and the men throwing away their guns and running like madmen. And them Rebs a-yelling as they came up on the charge with that peculiar yell they have." The success of Gordon's attack created confusion in Gordon's own line. The regiments were disordered, and Johnston's brigade, seeing some Union soldiers rallying on his left, retreated, leaving Gordon basically alone. Hoffman's Virginians had moved out of their entrenchments, but only 2 regiments, the 58th and 31st Virginia, made an attack. Some Virginians mistakenly fired a volley into Gordon's brigade, which caused even more disruption in the attack. The Virginians made it to the breastworks of the enemy, but a heavy volley sent them to the rear. The Virginians made it to the breastworks of the enemy, but a heavy volley sent them to the rear. Seeing the attack fall apart, Gordon rode over to the rest of Hoffman's Virginians with his hat in his hand and tears in his eyes, begging the rest of the brigade to move forward. When they and Gordon's men advanced, they now ran into stiff resistance, as officers had been able to rally men as well as dispatch more troops to that sector. The darkness was also stalling the attack as the Virginians and Georgians lost unit cohesion as they moved through the woods. A Virginian wrote, "We thought we saw men lying on the ground to our front and supposed them to be our skirmishers. We marched up to them when they raised up and put their guns almost against our heads and fired." By 10:30 p.m. the attack was over, and the units went back to their respective sides. Other than some skirmishing, the Battle of the Wilderness now came to an end. Lieutenant Colonel Horace Porter, an aide to General Ulysses S. Grant, described the engagement. "Forest fires raged, ammunition trains exploded. The dead were roasted in the conflagration. The wounded, roused by its hot breath, dragged themselves along with their torn and mangled limbs in the mad energy of despair to escape the ravages of the flames, and every bush seemed hung with shreds of blood-stained clothing. Over the 2 days of battle, the Union lost 17,666 men, 2,246 killed, 12,037 wounded, and 3,383 captured. The Confederacy lost 11,033, 1,477 killed, 7,633 wounded, and 1,923 captured or missing. The battle had been horrendously bloody, with each army losing around 17% of its fighting force in 2 days. Grant, new to the Eastern theater of the war, stated, "Joe Johnston would have retreated after 2 days of such punishment." Lee was a completely different commander than his Western counterpart. Grant would write to Henry Halleck and the Lincoln administration that, "At present, we claim no victory over the enemy, neither have they gained a single advantage. The enemy pushed out of his fortifications to prevent their position being turned, and have been sooner or later driven back in every instance. Up to this hour, the enemy have not shown themselves in force within a mile of our lines." The Battle of the Wilderness ended on May 6th. Ulysses S. Grant, commander of all Union forces and making his headquarters with the Army of the Potomac, now had a decision to make. He hadn't made any headway in the thick underbrush of the Wilderness, so he could either move east to Fredericksburg and fight along the main rail line to Richmond, or move in a more southeasterly direction and bypass Robert E. Lee's right flank to put his army in between Robert E. Lee's army and the Confederate capital at Richmond. He would choose the latter. Early on May 7th, Grant sent word to the commander of the Army of the Potomac, George Gordon Meade, to begin moving his men toward Spotsylvania Courthouse. Governor K. Warren's 5th Corps would lead the advance. Robert E. Lee, commanding the Army of Northern Virginia, wagered that Grant would move toward Spotsylvania Courthouse, especially since intelligence reports indicated that the river crossing equipment had been removed from the Rapidan River. On May 7th, Lee ordered Richard Anderson, the temporary commander of James Longstreet's corps after that general's wounding on May 6th, to pull his men away from the front lines at dark and prepare to march toward Spotsylvania Courthouse. Anderson would take a crude road that Lee ordered Brigadier General William Pendleton to construct, known as Pendleton's Road. A sharp engagement between Union General Philip Sheridan's cavalry and Confederate General Jeb Stewart's cavalry raged at Todd's Tavern, a key location on the Brock Road, the most direct route to Spotsylvania Courthouse. Union cavalry controlled Todd Tavern, but Confederate cavalry remained on the Brock Road, blocking the path for the Union's 5th Corps. Late in the day, on May 7th, Anderson's Corps and Warren's 5th Corps began moving toward the courthouse. Fitzhugh Lee and his cavalry guarded the intersection of the Brock Road and the Old Courthouse Road, but Federal horsemen were behind him, already at Spotsylvania Courthouse. Anderson's Corps, led by Joseph Kershaw's division, was approaching the intersection to help Lee's cavalry. The Confederate cavalrymen, oversaw by their corps commander Jeb Stewart and their division commander Fitzhugh Lee, cut down small pine trees to form a breastwork to defend against the approaching Union infantry. Warren's 5th Corps was now going to attempt to capture the intersection leading to Spotsylvania Courthouse. The 3rd and 2nd South Carolina arrived first and took the place of the rebel horsemen. Lyle's brigade of Robinson's division met stiff resistance from the Confederate infantry. The withering fire from the South Carolinians forced Lyle's men back, even before some of them came into battle line, but there were more blue troops coming. A member of the 2nd South Carolina remembered that when Union troops reached a large wild cherry tree on the right side of the road, the 3rd fired a solid and withering volley into it, and this was quickly followed by a similar volley by our regiment. The Federals seemed completely surprised, staggered, and as we continued our rain of lead into their ranks, broke and retreated in great disorder down the hill and took shelter in a woods in their rear. More rebels were making their way to the scene of the engagement. Anderson and Joseph Kershaw, not knowing the terrain, had Jeb Stewart place the infantry regiments as they came up. The rest of John Hennigan's troops filed to the left as Joseph Bartlett and Andrew Dennison's Union brigades reached the field. The Marylanders under Dennison were just as surprised to see Confederate infantry as Lyle's men were, and in a rush to attack, intermingled into a solid mass. In the attack by Dennison, John Robinson was shot in the knee, and Dennison was hit in the arm. Both men would lose their limbs to amputation. Charles Phelps, who took over as commander of Dennison's brigade, would be pinned under his horse. The Marylanders, after a brief fight, pulled away from the engagement. Joseph Bartlett was unsure about attacking the Confederate position. His division commander, Charles Griffin, ordered him to take the position, but Bartlett was concerned about the enemy's strength and artillery in front of him. When Bartlett insisted on Griffin looking at the situation personally, Griffin arrived and looked at the Confederate position. Griffin explained that all that was in front of them was a few dismounted cavalry, and for him to take it with the bayonet. Bartlett's men rushed into the woods concealing the South Carolinians. The Pennsylvanians on the brigade's right made it to the breastworks, but many were taken prisoner, as they were too tired to fight or run from the previous couple days of hard marching and fighting. Bartlett's men now fell back. Warren was in a desperate situation. He was to lead the Union Army to Spotsylvania Courthouse, but now 3 of his brigades had been thrown back. Warren had to clear the road. More of his brigades were now on the field, and he would try to dislodge the rebels again. Romaine Ayres's brigade advanced at a diagonal with Swatzer's 62nd Pennsylvania on their right, at almost a perpendicular angle to the Confederates, who threw flanking fire into the Union ranks. The attack didn't last long as the blue regiments faded from the field. Warren now only had Jacob Swatzer's brigade and Richard Coulter's brigade available to attack, but Swatzer's brigade was spread out, guarding artillery batteries, so Coulter was left to attack the Confederate works. Reports are scarce as to what happened during Coulter's attack, or even in what formation the men were in, but apparently they got close enough to the rebel breastworks to plant at least one flag on the entrenchments, then were pushed back. To the southeast, Wilson's cavalry, who stayed in control of Spotsylvania Courthouse during the opening phase of the engagement, would lose control of the location when Goodbrine and William Wofford's brigades approached from the south, which made Confederate control of the Brock Road and the Old Courthouse Road intersection more secure. Lysander Cutler, former commander of the Iron Brigade, now rode at the head of William Wadsworth's division when that division commander got mortally wounded in the Wilderness. The division now marched down the Brock Road, ready to be fed into the fortified Confederate position. More than just the Union division under Cutler made it to the field. Charles Field's division of Anderson's corps also made it to the intersection of the Old Courthouse Road and the Brock Road, bent on preventing Grant from getting to the courthouse. When the three brigades of Cutler attacked, each brigade faced trouble. Rice's front line, made up of the 95th New York and the 52nd Pennsylvania, got turned back from the Spindle Farm amidst the burning of the Spindle home, which had been targeted by Confederate artillery because Union sharpshooters used it as a concealed location to fire on the rebel lines. Edward Bragg and William Robinson ran into part of William Perry's Alabama Brigade, who had also advanced against the approaching Federal soldiers. With flanking fire hitting them, as well as gunfire from the front, Cutler's division pulled back. It was now about 11:30 a.m. on May 8th, and the Army of Northern Virginia was making a stand on the Brock Road. Each side now rushed troops to the precarious sector. Grant was unlike other Union generals Lee had faced. Such a stubborn stand in the Wilderness may have convinced other Union generals to retreat, but Grant was moving south. When the soldiers in the Army of the Potomac began their march toward Spotsylvania Courthouse, they cheered because they were heading toward Richmond, not like the other times where a hard-fought battle resulted in a Northern withdrawal. Major General Governor K. Warren had been a rising star in the Army of the Potomac, and when Ulysses S. Grant placed his headquarters with that army, he had great hope in that commander, and even believed he would be a good replacement for the Army commander George Meade if that was needed. However, the first 2 weeks in May dashed Grant's optimism about Warren. The 5th Corps commander was hesitant in the Wilderness, and now, in the opening stages of the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse, he had thrown his brigades in piecemeal against an entrenched Confederate line. Warren informed Meade that he was now entrenched, but Meade wanted him to attack. Warren's divisions were just too bloodied from the fight on the morning of May 8th. However, Meade informed him that John Sedgwick and his 6th Corps was on the way to support Warren. After a brief stopover at Chancellorsville, where his men ate lunch, Sedgwick's men marched on to join Warren in the quickly erupting battle. The hesitant Warren would wait on Sedgwick. Ambrose Burnside's 9th Corps was following Sedgwick's corps, and Winfield Scott Hancock's 2nd Corps moved south to Todd's Tavern. One of Sedgwick's soldiers remembered the hard march in the May heat. The heat was intense, the undergrowth shutting off any breeze, the dust ankle deep and light as air, so that the atmosphere was filled with it. Many of the men suffered from sunstroke, fallen in the ranks, and were lifted to the roadside by comrades. Ewell's corps slipped behind Anderson's troops and moved to the east. Hill's corps would be the last to start marching toward Spotsylvania Courthouse, leaving around 3 p.m., but not with Hill at its head. Prostatitis debilitated Hill so much so that he needed to be temporarily replaced. Lee would choose Jubal Early to take command of Hill's corps. Ewell placed his divisions to the right of Anderson's men. Both Meade and Grant wanted Warren and Sedgwick to attack the Confederate line immediately, but Sedgwick wanted to be briefed on the situation in his front from Warren, so the attack was delayed. At around 6 p.m., Warren rode up to the New Jersey Brigade near the Brock Road and ordered it forward. The 3rd New Jersey was in a skirmish line, with the 15th New Jersey in line of battle behind them. When they stepped off, they found they were the only ones moving forward. The men from New Jersey miraculously made it to the breastworks of the rebels, but because both of their flanks were exposed, they couldn't remain there long, and retreated back across the field. The attack wasn't just supposed to involve the men from New Jersey. Brigades to their right and left were supposed to move out as well, but Sedgwick's men to the left were called off from attacking, and the ones to the right didn't move either. Another attack was being planned, which would see the brigades of Joseph Fisher and William Talley from Crawford's division, and a conglomeration of regiments from Schweitzer's and Bartlett's brigades, made up of the 20th Maine, 118th Pennsylvania, 16th Michigan, and some soldiers from the 9th and 22nd Massachusetts, all led by Colonel Charles Herring of the 118th Pennsylvania. The men were poised to strike the right flank of the Confederate line, but some of Ewell's brigades were making it to the field before the attack was made. At 6:30 p.m., The 3 brigades stepped off to attack the Confederate flank, but ran into Benjamin Humphreys' Mississippians, supported by Cullen Battle's Alabamians. Major General Robert Rhodes, Battle's division commander, rode up to his old brigade and yelled, "Boys, you played hell the other evening. Now, when the order is given, I want you to run over those Yankees in front." The Alabamians attacked and sent the front line under Talley to the rear, but Fisher's line made a stubborn stand. However, the growing darkness made Fisher afraid that who he was firing on were members of Talley's troops, so he ordered a ceasefire. Battle kept up the gunfire, and Fisher's men melted away, leaving the brigade under Herring alone. Herring wouldn't be outdone and ordered his regiments to throw volleys into the Alabamians. Each side kept up a steady fire, killing and maiming a good many. The 61st Alabama approached the flank of the Union Brigade, but the 16th Michigan blocked their flanking attempt. A member of the 20th Maine remembered, "Our men were in just the right mood to fight, weary, hungry, discouraged, mad. In such a condition, it is as easy to die as to run," and so they decided to hold their position until ordered to leave. A Confederate rode of the melee. Swords clashed and revolvers that had never left their holsters to be discharged in anger were freely used. Shouts, yells, imprecations heard above the noise of battle were incessant. Alone, a mile beyond relief, menaced by death or captivity, the men were in a mood to fight and fight hard. Front, rear, and flanks were lost in the whirl. Organization was gone, each man depended upon himself. Darkness increased the confusion, and the result hung upon personal tenacity. Shouting helped to encourage the combatants, and ours, deeper, louder, more determined, was the most assuring. As Battle and Herring engaged in a fierce fight, 3 more Union brigades assembled for an attack. Henry Eustis's brigade began to act erratically, and when Sedgwick asked what was wrong, the commander of the 37th Massachusetts said that Eustis was drunk and that he could organize the men himself. Sedgwick agreed, and Eustis was walked back to the rear. The 3 brigades advanced, but the darkness and the foliage made it difficult to keep the battle lines together. One soldier remembered that his regiment advanced from half to 3/4 of a mile, and the enemy developed in such strong force that, owing to the approach of darkness and the weariness of his men, he concluded it best not to force the fight and withdrew his attacking lines a short distance. Some brigades slowed down and others sped up. More brigades from Robert Rhodes' division counterattacked. Both sides fired volleys, but it was difficult to fight in the darkness. Confusion ran rampant through the ranks and then faded away as both sides pulled back, except for Herring, whose brigade would remain out front until 3 a.m. General Meade fumed with anger about how the day's actions went. He targeted nearly everyone in his complaints to his aide. Burnside moved too slowly. Sedgwick hadn't come up soon enough. Warren was hesitant and cautious, and he even believed that the always dependable Hancock had failed to take the initiative in his movements toward the Union position on the Brock Road. Anderson and Ewell's men got their men quickly to the field and prepared breastworks when placed on line next to their comrades. The next day, May 9th, Burnside would make it to the Union left flank, and Hancock made it to the right flank. Hoping to turn the Confederate left flank and capture a rebel wagon train rumbling along the Shady Grove Road, Grant and Meade ordered Hancock to attack across the Po River. First, just a few brigades went across, fighting with Confederate cavalry. More brigades went across on orders from the Army commander. However, Ambrose Wright's Confederate brigade of Georgians, also guarding the wagon train, stood in the way of the Federal Corps. Once the wagon train made it across the Blockhouse Bridge, Wright pulled back across the bridge as well. Grant instructed Hancock to cross the bridge, but by the time his corps was prepared to cross, it was 10 p.m. Hancock sent a message to Meade requesting orders. Meade told Hancock to prepare to cross at first light on May 10th. May 9th had been for the most part quiet, except for the attacks by Hancock. Both sides dug in for protection. John Sedgwick, the 6th Corps commander, was placing his troops near where the 2 branches of the Brock Road converged, where the opening phase of the battle erupted. Sharpshooters played havoc in that area, especially Confederate sharpshooters. Sedgwick noticed that a regiment from New Jersey had been placed in front of some artillery, and ordered his aide to move them out of the way so the artillery could fire without hitting their own men. As the men began throwing up breastworks, sharpshooter bullets began to whiz by the men's heads. The Federal soldiers jumped for cover. Sedgwick saw this and stated, "What? What? Men dodging this way for single bullets? What will you do when they open fire along the whole line? I am ashamed of you. They couldn't hit an elephant at this distance." A moment later, Sedgwick tumbled from his saddle, shot just below the left eye, killing him instantly. Meade placed Horatio Wright, the senior division commander, as commander of the 6th Corps. Previous to the Overland Campaign, Wright served as an engineer overseeing the building of fortifications around Washington, D.C. and along the coast. Then he was sent west in 1862. There he commanded the Department of the Ohio until being replaced by Ambrose Burnside. In May 1863, Wright would come back east and be given a division command in Sedgwick's 6th Corps just in time for the Gettysburg Campaign. Grant, Meade, and Lee's plans for May 10th would make a bloody day during the Overland Campaign, as each side tried to exploit a weakness in the other. As the sun rose over the Spotsylvania battlefield on the morning of May 10th, Winfield Scott Hancock and his 2nd Corps were preparing to attack the Confederate left flank at Blockhouse Bridge. However, 11 pieces of artillery and William Mahone's division guarded the crossing. Hancock sent word back to George Meade and Ulysses S. Grant, informing them of the stiff resistance at the bridge, but agreed to attack if ordered to. Meanwhile, Robert E. Lee sent Henry Heath's division of A.P. Hill's corps, which was temporarily under the command of Jubal Early, to the Confederate left, hoping to outflank the flankers. Part of John Brooks' brigade and John Crocker's brigade marched south to find potential fords across the Po River. Crocker ran into part of Heath's division, and Brooke found a crossing, put one brigade across, formed it into battle line, but it wasn't adequate enough to move the entire corps across that ford. Crocker's men and Brooks' men returned to the Shady Grove Church Road with the rest of the 2nd Corps. Also that morning, Grant telegraphed Washington asking for as many men and ammunition as Henry Halleck could scrape together. The entire morning of May 10th, Governor K. Warren and Horatio Wright probed the Confederates in their front, attempting to find a weak spot, but every skirmish line or regiment he sent forward came back with the same assessment. The Confederates were dug in and in full strength, except on Wright's left front, which put up less resistance than the others. The division of Gershom Mott from Hancock's 2nd Corps was supposed to form a link between Wright's left flank and Ambrose Burnside's right flank. Burnside had crossed the Nye River and was now about a mile and a half from the courthouse, but he stayed idle that morning into the early afternoon. Although, during the skirmishing with Wilcox's Confederate division, one of Burnside's division commanders, Thomas Stevenson, was shot in the back of the head, killing him instantly. Daniel Leisure would take over command of the division, with Gilbert Robinson taking command of Leisure's brigade. With the information from Wright that the Confederate position around the McCool House possessed less troops than the other sectors, Grant believed that Lee was shifting troops to deal with Hancock's corps. To stop this, Grant wanted Wright, Warren, and Hancock to attack the sector held by Charles Field's division at 5 p.m. Hancock pulled all but Barlow's men away from the flank in order to assemble his corps for the large assault. Neither Hancock nor Grant realized that Heath's division was already on the move and ready to strike Hancock's now isolated division. It was afternoon when Heath's skirmishers made themselves known to Barlow's division, and Barlow could tell by the pressure that it was more than just a skirmish line. He informed Hancock, who informed Meade about the approaching infantry. Meade wanted Hancock to bring Barlow to the north side of the Po River. At 2 p.m., Barlow brought 3 of his brigades back toward the river to protect them in case of an attack and protect the river crossing. At 2:30, Heath attacked. The bloody engagement saw the Confederates attack the Union position 3 times, with the 3rd time resulting in hand-to-hand fighting, but nothing was budging the Federal troops. Heath's men pulled back a little distance and skirmished from long range. Heath's corps commander, Jubal Early, brought up artillery which peppered Barlow's position, igniting the forest and turning it into a blazing inferno. The smoke and flames became too much for the blue troops, and they began to pull back from their position. Early ordered Heath to make another attack, and when Heath told Early that his men were out of ammunition, Early said for him to holler them across. Heath's troops charged Barlow's division and sent them to the other side of the river. A member of the 52nd New York, to avoid breathing in the smoke, put a blanket over his head and sprinted for 150 yards to the river crossing. He admitted that he hit a few trees along the way, but made it to safety. Some regiments made an organized retreat, and some ran for their lives, but nevertheless extracting Barlow's men from danger was an incredible feat, and Hancock and Barlow were praised for their abilities. Not knowing that the Federals were ordered to retreat, Heath and Early both claimed to have drove them from the field, and although the attacks and flames did push the Federals back, the reason they didn't stay and fight was because Hancock ordered them back across the river. Brigadier General John Cook, the brother-in-law of Jeb Stewart, suffered a minor wound to the leg, which didn't make him leave the field, but Henry Walker's wound did. Robert Mayo replaced him in command. In preparation for their 5 p.m. assault, Warren's troops pushed in the Confederate skirmishers and formed battle lines. Because of the precarious nature in no man's land between the lines, Warren petitioned Meade to let the attack begin at 4 p.m. against Grant's earlier orders. Meade agreed, and Grant knew about the change in plans but didn't give a rebuttal. The Union troops didn't like the looks of the positions they were supposed to take. One Union soldier wrote, "The enemy had cut down all the trees in front of his position, felling them outward and trimming the branches, thus forming an impenetrable abattis that the Union soldiers could not enter. Behind this tangle, stretched to the right and left, were elaborate fortifications several feet high, manned by Confederate riflemen, who poured a destructive fire upon the division as it was uncovered from the woods. The Union brigades rushed forward at around 4 p.m. and were met with withering fire from the rebel breastworks. One rebel artilleryman explained that his piece used double canister every time it fired, destroying the Federal lines before they could even reach the breastworks. The beleaguered troops fell back to the safety of their own works. Before Warren moved up the time of the attack, Hancock was supposed to oversee the attack, but Barlow's scrape across the Po River delayed him from that duty. Hancock arrived on the field about 5:30 to reform the scattered ranks and inform the brigades that another attack would be made at 6. Meade pushed the time back to 7 p.m. More Union brigades were now on the field, and at 7 they stepped off against the rebel fortifications. But this time, there was little success. Hobart Ward's brigade broke through John Gregg's battle line. However, the success was short-lived, and Gregg and Anderson counterattacked, and the second Union assault came to a bloody end, again in failure. These weren't the only attacks scheduled for May 10th. A main assault destined for the Salient in the Confederate line called the Mule was also a target. The Mule formed around the McCool House, was 1,800 yards wide and 1,300 yards deep. Lee called it a wretched line, but Ewell assured him that he could hold it, so Lee kept Ewell's corps there. As the battle developed, the Confederate troops in that corps conformed to the terrain as they were deployed, and what emerged was that salient. Large oak trees were cut down and stacked on top of one another to breast height, and trenches dug to give the men added protection. A Union engineer scouted the Mule and found that troops could attack the northwest sector by remaining unseen in the trees until close to the fortifications. Colonel Emory Upton, a young officer with amazing potential, was chosen to lead the attack, commanding 12 regiments placed in columns to give the attack depth. Upton was told, "Upton, you are to lead those men upon the enemy's works this afternoon. If you do not carry them, you are not expected to come back. But if you carry them, I am authorized to say that you will get your stars." Upton replied, "I will carry those works. If I don't, I will not come back." Each row of regiments were given orders that would hopefully open up a gap in the Confederate line and exploit it, allowing more troops to rush in. Gershom Mott's division was also to attack, to relieve pressure from Upton's attack, but they attacked earlier in the day and wouldn't join the assault. For a good while, Upton instructed Union artillery to bombard the Confederate position. Then, about 6:30 p.m., the Union regiments emerged from the trees and advanced toward the Mule against George Dole's Georgians. A Union soldier remembered, "The enemy sitting in their pits with pieces upright, loaded, and with bayonets fixed, ready to impale the first who should leap over, absolutely refused to yield the ground. Others, seeing the fate of their comrades, held their pieces at arm's length and fired downward, while the others, poising with their pieces vertically, hurled them down upon their enemy, pinning them to the ground. Upton's men surged over the breastworks, impaling many with the bayonet. The artillery positioned to Dole's left raked Upton's line with canister, but its officer called on the pieces to cease firing when their comrades were charging. As the artillerymen gave a cheer, they looked out over the field and saw that their fellow gray-clad comrades were indeed running, but they didn't have any muskets. Nearly whole companies were captured by Upton's men, and they were now running to the rear as prisoners of war. The Union regiments fanned out, opening the gap wider to allow their comrades to surge into the breach. Captain Benjamin Smith, commanding 4 artillery pieces to the left of Dole's, lost part of his foot a year before and could only hobble. Now that the blue troops were fanning out in all different directions, it was every man for himself. A large Union soldier picked up Smith, threw him over his shoulder like a sack of flour, and carried him off as a prisoner. Confederate troops from all around the Mule converged on the breach and began beating back the Union assault columns. A bloody and terrible struggle over the newly captured ground left dead and dying strewn all over the works. A member of Upton's columns remembered, "It was but a shattered remnant of that noble column which rushed from the woods against the hostile works, and finding that reinforcements were reaching the enemy, while our columns were every moment melting away, a retreat was ordered. Upton and his division commander, David Russell, ordered the retreat from the field. The Union soldiers resented having to leave their dead and wounded in the hands of the Confederate troops, but without support there was little else to be done. The historian of the 121st New York summarized the action by writing, "Upton's formation, arrangement, and conduct of the assaulting columns was superb. There was not a single miscarry in the whole affair. The men behaved with splendid courage and skill, which had made them famous throughout the army. The rebels fought desperately and were accounted as good as there were in Lee's army." Lee called Rhodes to the McCool house and asked the division commander, "What shall we do with General Doles for allowing those people to break over his lines?" Rhodes may have felt that Lee's comment was also a rebuke of himself and said, "We shall have to let Doles off this time." Near the end of the day, and at about the same time that Upton and his men were fighting for their lives, Burnside on the far Union left flank gave a half-hearted and slow-moving attempt at engaging the Confederates around Spotsylvania Courthouse, but he would fall back to his original position near the Nye River. The Army of the Potomac's medical director, Dr. Thomas McFarland, recorded over 4,000 casualties on May 10th alone for the Union, and an estimated 2,500 for the Confederacy. May 10th had been the bloodiest day for both armies since leaving the Wilderness. Union Cavalry Commander Philip Sheridan met with the Army of the Potomac Commander George Meade and had a heated exchange. They had already gotten off on a wrong foot when Sheridan took the bulk of the cavalry and left the Army of the Potomac to fend for itself at the Battle of the Wilderness, and now Sheridan laid out a new plan to Meade: concentrate all the cavalry and move out in force against Jeb Stewart's command and whip it. Sheridan wanted to pull Stewart away from the fight around Spotsylvania Courthouse, bring his command out in the open, and utterly destroy the mounted arm of the Army of Northern Virginia. Stewart provided Lee with great information and screened his movements incredibly well, and Sheridan knew that if he eliminated Stewart's force, he would make Lee blind on the battlefield and on the campaign. Meade went to Ulysses S. Grant, commander of all Union forces, and relayed the conversation he had with Sheridan. Grant responded, "Let him start right out and do it." In the evening on May 8th, Sheridan called his commanders together and said, "We are going out to fight Stewart's cavalry in consequence of a suggestion from me. We are strong, and I know we can beat him. And in view of my recent representations to General Meade, I shall expect nothing but success." Sheridan readied his corps, 3 whole divisions, made up of 10,000 horsemen in all, and 6 batteries of horse artillery, and moved out at 6 a.m. on May 9th, as Lee and Grant were jockeying for position at Spotsylvania Courthouse. Jeb Stewart, commander of the cavalry for the Army of Northern Virginia, learned about the movement of Sheridan's corps at about 8 a.m., and quickly dispatched Brigadier General William Wickham's brigade to nip at the heels of Sheridan's long column. Stewart formed an audacious plan, made even more so because his force was a small fraction of Sheridan's entire cavalry corps. Stewart would use Lunsford Lomax's brigade of Fitzhugh Lee's division and James Gordon's brigade of Rooney Lee's division to hopefully bring the large Union force to battle somewhere north of Richmond. Stewart mistakenly believed Sheridan was aiming for Richmond, but Sheridan was, instead, aiming for Stewart. Later in the day on May 9th, the 2 other brigades set out after Sheridan. By the night of the 9th, Wesley Merritt's division was already at Beaver Dam Station, recapturing some Federal soldiers who were on their way to Richmond for imprisonment and destroying part of the railroad around the station. Sheridan moved out of Beaver Dam Station on the morning of May 10th and continued south to Ground Squirrel Bridge, where he and his command rested. Stewart, on the other hand, didn't have that luxury. He wanted to push on to Yellow Tavern and turn Sheridan away from the capital, but Fitzhugh Lee refused to go any further without rest. Stewart allowed for about 5 hours of rest, and by 3 a.m. on May 11th, the Confederate cavalry pushed on to Yellow Tavern with his 2 brigades from Fitzhugh Lee's division. Sheridan awoke on the morning of May 11th, left David M. Gregg's division at Ground Squirrel Bridge, and moved the other 2 divisions toward Yellow Tavern. At Ground Squirrel Bridge, Gordon skirmished with Gregg's men, and Gregg even sent 1 brigade to Ashland Station to destroy what he could of that location and the railroad. Gregg thought that by destroying the Ground Squirrel Bridge that it would stop Gordon, but the Confederate general found what was considered an impassable ford and dashed across, driving Gregg's cavalry away, but suffering great casualties as the fight devolved into a pistol and saber battle. On the morning of May 11th, 1864, Jeb Stewart, the flamboyant cavalryman, seemed subdued. His chief of staff remembered that, He was more quiet than usual, softer, and more communicative. Earlier, he mentioned that he didn't expect to survive the war, and he would rather not live in a conquered South. His chief of staff concluded that it seemed now that the shadow of the near future was already upon him. Stewart was only 7 miles from Richmond while at Yellow Tavern. He sent a note to Braxton Bragg, Confederate President Jefferson Davis's military advisor, asking if he thought Richmond's defenses could handle Sheridan. If so, Stewart would wait and attack Sheridan in the flank. Bragg wrote back that his defenses could throw back Sheridan, but Stewart wouldn't receive the response until 2 p.m., after he was already engaged with Sheridan. Lomax aligned his brigade on the Telegraph Road with his artillery on his right flank. Skirmishers were thrown out in front of his line. Stewart knew that Wickham's brigade would soon arrive and Bragg's troops from Richmond would be coming from the south, so hopefully they together could box in Sheridan and destroy him. Sheridan's troops under Merritt attacked Lomax's position. As Stewart and Lomax observed the battle from a high point north of Lomax's line, the outnumbered rebel horsemen were holding their own. Stewart sent an aide to Colonel Henry Clay Pate, who commanded the battle line as Lomax was with Stewart, to tell the officer to hold at all hazards. When the aide arrived, he found that the situation was deteriorating. What looked like a stubborn stand from afar turned out to be chaos within the Confederate ranks. The aide told Pate the orders. I can see Colonel Pate now as he stood, looking me square in the eye with his cold gray eyes and pallid face, but uttering no response. Thinking that he had not heard me, I leaned over my horse closer to him and spoke louder, repeating the order. The colonel still did not respond, but the aide saw he had heard and understood my orders in their full significance, as it was a veritable death sentence. The Union regiments broke the flanks of Pate's line and nearly surrounded the 5th Virginia, the only regiment still left from the battle line. The other 2 regiments retreated to the east side of the Telegraph Road, and Wickham's brigade arrived to give support. Pate remained with the 5th Virginia. He yelled, "One more round, boys, then we'll get to the hill." Then a bullet smashed into his forehead, killing him instantly. About 200 men from the 5th Virginia surrendered as the blue troops swarmed over the area. The messenger now arrived from Bragg at 2 p.m., informing Stewart that Richmond's defenses could hold against Sheridan. Sheridan had sent 2 regiments and an artillery battery south to Richmond to stop any reinforcements from getting to Stewart, but they found none. Stewart's command was alone. At 3 p.m., Stewart sent another message to Bragg. Now, General, if we can make a combined attack on them with Hunton's brigade, I cannot see how they can escape. I have attacked once and feel confident of success. They drove our extreme left back a little, but we have been driving their rear and left. As soon as Gordon joins my right, I will try them again, and expect to get so as to command the intersection. The enemy fights entirely as infantry today, though yesterday we got in with sabers with good execution. I am glad to report enemies killed large in proportion. The communication was filled with inaccuracies that downplayed the situation, as well as optimism. Not long after his message was sent, Stewart got word from Gordon that he had defeated Sheridan's force at Ground Squirrel Bridge. Stewart shouted, "Bull for Gordon," then lowered his head and mumbled, "I wish he was here." Sheridan used the lull in the battle to realign his troops. The troops on either side of the Telegraph Road were dismounted cavalry, but he chose 3 mounted regiments, the 1st Michigan, 7th Michigan, and 1st Vermont Cavalry regiments, to charge and take the Confederate battery on the road in the center of Stewart's line. One soldier recalled, "In all directions over the field, regiments or brigades, upon the trot or gallop, in columns of 4s, companies, squadrons, or battalions, with batteries galloping into position, and here and there reserves drawn up in line as straight and motionless as stone walls." A heavy rain began to fall, and lightning flashed through the sky as the Union soldiers advanced and charged. The Michiganders captured half of the artillery battery, with the other half limbering up and pulling away in time. But the Confederate line was now split. Stewart needed to seal the breach. He brought up the reserves, and the sudden appearance of Virginia horsemen blunted the Michiganders' momentum. Stewart remained at the front, attempting to help seal the breach, emptying his revolver into the oncoming blue masses. A Michigander named John A. Huff spotted an officer on horseback and shot him with his revolver. It was Stewart. The bullet entered his left side just above the belt, passed through his stomach, and came out his back. The commander of Company K of the 1st Virginia caught Stewart as he slipped off his saddle. Stewart told the officer to save his men. As the wounded cavalier was taken to an ambulance destined for Richmond, he saw some of his men running. He yelled, go back, and do your duty as I have done mine, and our country will be safe. Go back, go back. I had rather die than be whipped." Stewart would pass away the next day from his wounds. Fitzhugh Lee, now in command of the Confederate cavalry on the field, extracted his troops from the desperate situation, fighting a rearguard action that stubbornly held Sheridan's men at bay until darkness allowed them to get north of the Chickahominy River to rest. Soon, Sheridan was back on the move, first crossing the Chickahominy after a sharp fight with Fitzhugh Lee and Confederate infantry coming from Richmond. He then moved back across the Chickahominy at Bottom's Bridge. After leaving the outskirts of Richmond, the ride was fairly uneventful because Confederates turned their attention away from him once he turned away from Richmond. Sheridan made it to Haxall's Landing and the safety of Benjamin Butler's Army of the James on May 14th. His ride had been a success. He drew a large segment of Lee's cavalry away from Spotsylvania Courthouse, eliminated Jeb Stewart, Lee's eyes and ears, and threatened Richmond. As Union General Philip Sheridan and Confederate General Jeb Stewart battled at Yellow Tavern on May 11th, just a few miles north of Richmond, Union Generals Ulysses S. Grant and George Meade planned their next assault against Robert E. Lee's lines, directing their attention toward the Mule, a salient in Lee's lines. Grant instructed 2nd Corps Commander Winfield Scott Hancock to move his corps from the right flank to the center around the Brown House. Union Colonel Emory Upton led 12 regiments in an assault that broke the Confederate line at that salient on May 10th, and now Grant planned to use the entire 2nd Corps to crush that salient. Confederate Army Commander Robert E. Lee received word of the enemy movements. Lee was adept at recognizing patterns and predicting how Union commanders would act in situations, but this information led him to a great miscalculation. He mistook the Army movements as meaning Grant was moving east to Fredericksburg to start a new advance toward Richmond. Lee conferred with his corps commanders and decided that if Grant was on the move, then they should strike the Union Army as it moved. He planned to use Ewell's corps to perform this strike, and because the heavy rains made movement slow, ordered Ewell to pull all but 8 artillery pieces away from the Mule. Over 20 cannons rolled away from the salient. Confederate General Edward Johnson commanded most of the troops at the Mule and was astonished to see the pieces roll away. During the evening of May 11th and into the night, Johnson could hear troops marching, halting, and chopping bushes and trees in front of the salient. Some kind of assault was imminent. He went to his corps commander, Richard Ewell, and requested the artillery pieces returned. Ewell ordered them back, but rain delayed the message from getting to his artillery chief and delayed the movement of the pieces back to the salient. The movement of troops heard by Johnson was Hancock's 3 divisions moving into place. Hancock met with his division commanders about 7 p.m. and informed them about their 4 a.m. planned assault. The Union soldiers were already tired. One staffer wrote, "The movement was necessarily slow with frequent halts, at which time the men, worn out by loss of sleep and the terrible nervous and physical strain they had endured during the past 8 days, would drop down for a moment's rest and be asleep as soon as they touched the ground." The front of the marching columns got to the Brown House about 12:30 a.m. Francis Barlow, one of Hancock's division commanders, yelled to a 2nd Corps aide, "For heaven's sake, at least face us in the right direction, so that we shall not march away from the enemy and have to go around the world and come up in the rear." Hancock's corps was packed tightly, with Barlow's division in front, David Birney's division behind them, and John Gibbon's division in the rear. 5 paces separated the regiments, and 10 paces separated brigades. Ambrose Burnside's 9th Corps also formed up to add weight to Hancock's attack, determined to link up with the 2nd Corps' left flank. These troops were poised for a massive assault. 20,000 troops were in Hancock's corps alone. Hancock's troops were aroused about 3:30 a.m. The 2nd Corps commander asked Meade for a delay since a dense fog covered the landscape. Meade agreed, and Hancock waited until 4:30. The attack began with the divisions moving forward. The Pioneer Corps, armed with axes, walked behind the skirmish line to remove any major obstacles in the way. A soldier from Massachusetts remembered, "Neither drum to beat the charge nor bugle to sound the call, none of the accessories that usually accompany warlike forces and give to them pomp and circumstance to fill the eye and feed the imagination were here. There were no officers on horseback, hurrying hither and thither, in front or on either flank, giving life, color, and imagination to the field with their clattering sabers, waving plumes, and brilliant uniforms. Neither were there any picturesque groups of them in the background. Everyone was on foot, for all horses were left behind the lines." James Walker, commander of the Stonewall Brigade, recalled, "The heavy tramp of a large body of infantry and the sharp words of command could be distinctly heard. Very soon our skirmishers came falling back, firing as they came, and announced, what we already knew, that a heavy column was advancing to the attack. Our men were all up and ready for them with their muskets cocked, peering through the gloom for the first glimpse of their foes." Hancock's left, because of the darkness in which the men formed for the assault, was going to overshoot the Muleshoe, but its officers swung it so that it would hit the northeastern portion of the Muleshoe. When they did so, a gap emerged, and Robert McAllister's brigade of Mott's division filled the hole. When the Confederate soldiers pulled their triggers to let loose volleys into the approaching Federal soldiers, all that sounded was the percussion cap, as the rain had fouled their weapons and prevented them from discharging. This greatly affected the Stonewall Brigade, but others who kept their powder dry were able to send a volley of death into the blue ranks. Without artillery to deliver destruction to the Federals, those Union troops charged into the Confederate works. Before the attack, Hancock ordered his men to fix bayonets and not to stop to fire, so when his troops made it to the enemy entrenchments, it broke down into hand-to-hand fighting. George Maryland Stewart, commander of a brigade that encountered Barlow's division, was captured in the melee. Confederate division commander Edward Johnson, seeing his men desperately fighting, joined them in the combat, wielding his cane against Federal soldiers with fixed bayonets. Eventually, Johnson grabbed a rifled musket and knocked down 15 men before the Union soldiers overpowered him. Captured, Johnson ordered his men to surrender and called out to his enemy not to shoot his troops. The weight of the Union corps was too much, and the Confederate line collapsed. However, the success of the attack led to confusion within the Second Corps ranks. Units lost all cohesion and became more of a mob of soldiers than brigades and divisions. Barlow wrote years later that, "What ought to have been done was plain. We had carried the enemy's line at its extreme right and practically destroyed its defenders. The occasion for charging, for rush and confusion, was past, and troops ought to have been soberly and deliberately put in position and ordered to sweep down the rebel line towards his left, while provision was made to guard against an attack by the enemy's second line, or the remnant of his defeated troops, upon the ground which we had taken." Johnson's division had basically melted away. It entered the wilderness a few weeks prior with over 5,000 men. Now it numbered a little over 1,000, a loss of 78%. To the southeast, Burnside's corps was on the move against the east side of the Muleshoe. The 23rd and 37th Virginia of Maryland Stewart's brigade and the 28th North Carolina of James Lane's brigade were pushed back by Barlow's men and Burnside's approaching troops, but the rest of Lane's North Carolinians held the Union attacks at bay, doggedly holding on to their ground. New Confederate Division Commander John B. Gordon was Lee's reserves, and reports came in that unusual activity was to the north. He formed Robert Johnston's brigade and moved it forward to hopefully stem the tide of the Union advance. When he did, Johnston himself was gravely wounded, putting Thomas Garrett in command. The North Carolinians were hit by gunfire on three sides and forced to fall back to safety. Gordon, knowing that he needed to buy General Lee some time, ordered Garrett to attack again, but this time spread out his brigade to section off the Federals from penetrating the Confederate line any further. Garrett did as he was asked and moved his men forward. Again, the Federal gunfire hit the Tar Heels from three sides. Even stretching the brigade out didn't make it big enough to cordon off the Federals. Garrett was killed in the action, and Thomas Toone replaced him. The brigade withdrew to safety and awaited additional reinforcements. More were on the way. Gordon gathered Clement Evans' brigade and John Hoffman's Virginians to come to the scene of the action. Lee calmly surveyed the situation as Johnson's men came streaming south. He then rode to Evans and Hoffman's troops. Standing in the middle of them, he removed his hat and turned his horse Traveler toward the enemy. The Georgians told him that they didn't want him killed. Gordon claimed that he grabbed Traveler's bridle and said, "You must not expose yourself. Your life is too valuable to the Army and to the Confederacy for you to risk it so wantonly. We are Georgians. We are Virginians. We need no such encouragement." Gordon led the brigades against the fast-approaching mob of blue soldiers. The Federals didn't give up the ground easily, and a volley flew between the two sides, but the more organized Confederates stood more solidly than the loose group of Federals. Confederate brigades, not encountering any enemy forces in their front, were pulled out of the line and rushed toward the now occupied breastworks. Hand-to-hand fighting resulted as Hancock's troops didn't want to give up what they had captured. Northern troops still occupied the northernmost sector of the Muleshoe and poured lead into the flanks of the Confederates, who recaptured the works. Human gore filled the water puddles caused by the heavy rains. Men used bayonets, the butts of their rifles, and their very fists to attack one another. Every now and then the muskets would fire, and more dead and dying men would pile up higher and higher in the Confederate breastworks. It was now 6 a.m., and Hancock knew that his troops would be completely pushed away from the rebel works if reinforcements didn't emerge. Thomas Neal's division from Horatio Wright's 6th Corps approached the northwest sector of the Muleshoe to give aid to Hancock's beleaguered troops. However, Ramser's North Carolinians blocked their advance, so the blue troops threw up breastworks and engaged in long-distance exchanges of musketry, all the while ducking behind their hastily made breastworks to avoid artillery fire. When Johnson's line broke, Lee called for William Mahone's division, who guarded the Army's left flank, to come east and help seal the breach. The lead elements arrived about 7 a.m. in a driving rain. Abner Perrin's brigade arrived first. Seeing the chaos in front of them, Perrin remarked, "I shall come out of this fight a live Major General or a dead brigadier." Gordon guided the Alabamians where they were most needed, and Perrin charged into the breach. The brigade lost all cohesion because of the hectic charge and the fact that Perrin, their leader, was shot off his horse, wounded multiple times, and died from blood loss when a bullet nicked his femoral artery. The brigade broke up into pieces, with many of the men caught in a crossfire from their comrades behind them and enemy troops in front of them. So they hunkered down into some secondary works, awaiting an opportunity to make it to safety. Nathaniel Harris's Mississippi Brigade was next. Near the McCool House, they saw General Lee. An artillery shell passed by Traveler's stirrups, and a member of the brigade yelled out to Lee, "Can't you trust us?" General Lee replied, "Yes, I can trust you. Go, and may God go with you." Others yelled, go back, General Lee. For God's sake, go back." Lee stood up in his stirrups and yelled, "Mississippians, I go back under one condition, and that is that you go forward. Remember that you strike for Mississippi today." Harris charged his men to the right of Ramser's brigade, pushing back more Union troops from the entrenchments, but the gap in the line still remained. On the Union side, communication and cohesion broke down further. Lewis Grant's Vermont Brigade made it to the left of Hancock's line and then moved forward, entering the breastworks of Barlow's division, causing more chaos in the blue ranks, as now Barlow would have to separate his division from that brigade. He rode back to Hancock and told him of the confusion and said not to send any more reinforcements, that it would only make his ranks less coherent. The men from Vermont were supposed to go further southeast to link up with Burnside's right flank, but the orders were vague, so they moved into Barlow's lines. McGowan's South Carolinians from Wilcox's division of A.P. Hill's Corps was the next Confederate brigade to make it to the Muleshoe. The brigade was prepared to reclaim their reputation after the disaster at the Wilderness and rushed in. Charles Wilden of the 1st South Carolina carried the flag for his regiment. He was afflicted with epilepsy and couldn't keep up with his regiment, but went into the fight anyhow. When a bullet hit him in the shoulder and another broke his flagpole, he ripped the flag from the staff, wrapped it around himself, and charged into the breach. McGowan's men pushed the blue troops out of the northernmost sector of the Muleshoe, regaining all of the lost ground from the early morning attack by Hancock's 2nd Corps. The brigade lost its commander, McGowan, to an arm wound, and his replacement was killed nearly as soon as he took command, so command went to Joseph Brown of the 14th South Carolina. Emory Upton's brigade charged the reclaimed Confederate works and lost significant casualties in the attempt. His lead regiment lost 100 men just getting to the front because the musketry and artillery fire was so deadly. The brigade fell back with the rest of the 2nd Corps and part of the 6th Corps. Another brigade from the 6th Corps was also preparing for its own assault. Henry Brown's New Jersey Brigade fell on the right of Upton's brigade, and then attempted to hit Harris's brigade by going in between the Union and Confederate lines. The Southern soldiers played havoc on the right flank of the brigade. Miraculously, they made it to the Confederate entrenchments, and it quickly devolved into hand-to-hand combat, but the enormous casualties sustained during the attack made the brigade fall apart rather quickly. A man in that brigade recalled the scene later. "Terrific day of awful, murderous conflict. Combine the horrors of many battlefields, bring them into a single day and night of 24 hours, and the one of May 12th includes them all." One Union soldier remembered that dead rebels were piled in the entrenchments 3 to 4 bodies deep, and the rain only made life in the trenches worse as men strove to fire their easily fouled muskets. A Union soldier remembered, "The rebels were on one side of the breastwork and we on the other. We could touch their guns with ours. They would load, jump up, and fire into us, and we did the same to them. Almost every shot that was made took effect." Another wrote, "Our men fought the rebels close to the other side of the breastworks and knocked their guns aside, and jumped up in the works and shot them down." It was now just after 12 noon, and the battle for the Muleshoe broke down into a bitter stalemate, with neither side giving in. Lee knew that his men couldn't hold that position much longer and ordered what troops were available to construct a second set of earthworks south of the Harrison home. Lee hoped that his men could hold out until this new line was constructed. During the fight for the Muleshoe, commander of all Union forces Ulysses S. Grant and Army of the Potomac commander George Meade urged the 5th, 6th, and 9th Corps commanders to attack along their front to help relieve pressure on Hancock's 2nd Corps attempting to hold the Muleshoe, but none of the 3 corps attacked vigorously. Governor K. Warren's poor performance caused Grant to seek a replacement for the corps commander, but Meade intervened and asked Grant not to replace Warren. Ambrose Burnside and his 9th Corps' weak attacks on the morning of May 12th didn't relieve the pressure on Hancock's front, and now that Hancock's men were now in a stalemate outside the Confederate fortifications, something needed to break that stalemate. The Union and Confederate soldiers could touch rifles, they were so close, and individuals would jump up and fire into the other's works at point-blank range, then dive back into their entrenchments to load their rifles again. To break the stalemate, Grant wanted the battle to shift further east along Burnside's front. Burnside delayed, preferring to wait and see if an opportunity emerged, rather than attacking as ordered. After hours and repeated encouragement by Grant to move his men, Burnside prepared his men to attack around 2 p.m. On the Confederate side, Army Commander Robert E. Lee also sought to end the stalemate, knowing his troops couldn't hold out much longer. His engineers and available troops were constructing fortifications south of the Muleshoe, and an attack elsewhere might relieve pressure on that salient. Lee chose the same front that Grant chose to relieve the stalemate, the Confederate right flank near Spotsylvania Courthouse. One of Burnside's divisions moved out a little after 2 p.m. His troops advanced near the Confederate lines and then fell to the ground to avoid the bombardment let loose by the Confederate artillery at a salient known as Heath Salient that bristled with artillery. Lee arrived on the field and assessed the situation. Burnside's open left flank gave Lee an opportunity to defeat Burnside and to hopefully relieve pressure on the Muleshoe. He sent James Lane's North Carolinians and David Weisinger's Virginians to approach Burnside's left flank. The Confederates' sudden attack threw the Union troops into confusion. Artillery shells hit their front as musketry riddled their flank. The regiments on the immediate left broke quickly, while the ones to the right attempted to blunt the attack. Lane, after breaking up part of the flank, turned his attention to the artillery pieces, which blew holes in his line. The Tar Heels captured some of the pieces, but the retreating Federals ran through their left flank, resulting in some hand-to-hand combat and confusing his battle line. With no way to carry away the cannons and the Union attack coming to an end, the Confederate brigades withdrew to their entrenchments, and Burnside's attack ended. Although a few Union troops made it to within 50 yards of the Confederate line, the attacks were a failure. The fight for the Muleshoe was over. Now each general began to take stock of their commands. It's difficult to estimate the losses for just May 12th, but modern estimates are that the Union lost about 9,000 men, while the Confederacy suffered close to 8,000 casualties in that single day of action. One soldier remembered the scene. I was able to appreciate the full measure of its horrors. I shrink from the attempt to describe the scene. It was a ghastly and horrible example of the organized brutality that we call war. No language can adequately portray the sickening spectacle. Imagine, if you can, a line of entrenchments 400 yards in length, a solid wall of timber and earth forming its front, with traverses extending at short intervals to the rear, forming 8 or 10 pen-like enclosures, half filled with dead and dying men. They lay in piles, sometimes 5 men deep. Often the dead were lying upon the mortally wounded, who groaned in their death agony and begged for water and prayed for death. Bodies hung from the works in every form of mangling. Blood and mangling were everywhere, and the sickening stench of the battlefield was over it all. Ulysses S. Grant quickly went back on his promise to allow Meade to direct the campaign. Ever since the Wilderness, Grant began to issue direct orders to brigade, division, and corps commanders within the Army of the Potomac, reducing George Meade to what one historian called a high-level staff officer. Out of the 4 corps commanders under Grant, Sedgwick had been killed, replaced with Horatio Wright, who had yet to prove himself at a corps-level command. Governor K. Warren exhibited hesitancy and lack of aggression in every engagement thus far on the campaign. Winfield Scott Hancock also lacked the aggression exhibited before his wounding at Gettysburg, but he was regaining his old ways of handling the Second Corps, But with Warren and Wright's timidity, it was difficult to take advantage of military opportunities like at the Mule Shoe. Ambrose Burnside technically outranked Meade, so he answered directly to Grant. Burnside's aggression and quick movements in the East Tennessee campaign seemed to dissipate once he came back east, as displayed with his slowness and outright ignoring of Grant's orders. Robert E. Lee also lacked the officers and qualities needed to fight out the campaign. Out of the 4 corps commanders that he entered the Overland Campaign with, Jeb Stewart was dead, James Longstreet was badly wounded and would not return to the Army for months. A.P. Hill's prostatitis kept him from fighting at Spotsylvania Courthouse, but he would soon rejoin the ranks despite his debilitating illness. The only moderately healthy corps commander was Richard Ewell, but Lee was having second thoughts about him. At one point, Lee witnessed Ewell unmercifully beating some of the retreating soldiers with the flat end of his sword and cursing them. Lee rode up to him and said, "General Ewell, you must restrain yourself. How can you expect to control these men when you have lost control of yourself? If you cannot repress your excitement, you had better retire." Richard Anderson acted as Longstreet's temporary replacement, but had yet to distinguish himself as a corps commander, and Jubal Early was temporarily replacing A.P. Hill. Lee trusted Early as a division commander, but was still gauging his ability as a corps commander. Not only had Lee lost corps commanders, he had lost 13 brigade commanders thus far and a division commander. It was becoming difficult to find adequate replacements for the lost commanders. By the end of the 12th and into the early hours of the 13th of May, Lee pulled his troops away from the Mule Shoe to the new set of entrenchments a little south of the Harrison home. Grant sent troops forward, and they found empty entrenchments, but as they progressed south, they quickly discovered the new position taken up by the rebel soldiers. Now Grant had a decision to make: keep fighting it out along this line, or head east and south to bring Lee to battle a little closer to Richmond. Ultimately, Grant decided to fight it out along this line, but shift his troops to Lee's weak right flank. Throughout the 13th, the 5th and 6th Corps of the Army of the Potomac marched east to the Fredericksburg Road, shifting the battle. Likewise, Lee began moving his troops to combat the growing numbers of Federals on his right flank. Close to the Nye River, a hill called Myers Hill jutted up from the landscape. Both Lee, Meade, and Grant could see the utility in capturing the important location. Confederate horsemen already occupied the hill, with a brigade of cavalry not far away. On May 14th, Meade sent Brigadier General Emory Upton and 2 regiments already on the west side of the river to push the horsemen off the hill, along with the Confederate artillery. They did so, and when they did, this triggered Lee to send 2 brigades of men under Ambrose Wright and Nathaniel Harris down the Massaponax Road to drive the Federals from the hill that overlooked the field of battle. The Confederate infantry, with the cavalry on their right flank, overlapped the Union battle line perched atop Myers Hill. Each side threw volleys into one another, but the rebels gained the advantage and pushed Upton and his men off the hill. Determined to regain and hold the position, Meade issued orders for a division of troops to cross the Nye River and attack the position, but when they got there, the Confederates had already left, leaving it in the hands of Meade's troops. Ulysses S. Grant telegraphed Washington to send all the available troops that could be scraped together. The Overland Campaign was only 10 days old, yet his casualties had mounted to over 30,000. 20,000 troops would be on their way to him very soon, but he still needed to deal with Lee in his front while he waited for reinforcements. Most of his troops had shifted a great deal during the 14th to the 17th of May. Grant believed that Lee's right flank would be weak and ordered Horatio Wright to test that flank, but he ran into stiff resistance and told Grant as much. Grant would come up with another plan. Richard Ewell's 2nd Corps was battered, and Grant believed, with enough pressure and support, he could break that new line that Robert E. Lee formed south of the Harrison home. Through the night of the 17th and into the early morning of the 18th, Wright's 6th Corps and Hancock's 2nd Corps formed in almost their exact same positions as their May 12th attack on the Mule Shoe. At 4:30 a.m., Hancock's 3 divisions and 2 of Wright's divisions stepped off toward the new line of Confederate works. It was an early morning attack, but it didn't catch the Confederates off guard. They were ready with guns loaded and artillery trained on the ground in front of them. One soldier remembered the enemy's line of dead had been exposed to the hot rays of the sun for 6 days, and with the intense heat their faces had turned black and putrefaction set in. The line of battle wavered as the horrible sight presented itself to their view, but this was but for a moment. when everyone made an effort to step between the bodies. The march to the Confederate line convinced Brigadier General Joshua Owen that the attack was futile, and he withdrew without ever making contact with the enemy. This action would earn him a court-martial and loss of his command. The rest of the troops continued, but they, along with 2 brigades from Burnside's corps, were subjected to a withering fire from the Confederate entrenchments. The attacks quickly broke down, and the Union brigades got caught in a destructive fire that made them hug the ground for protection. Hancock asked for the attack to be called off, and it was agreed that his troops wouldn't attack anymore. It was difficult, but the troops extricated themselves from the destructive fire of artillery, which had nearly been solely responsible for throwing back the attackers. The attack racked up around 1,500 more casualties for the Union, considerably less for the Confederacy. By the end of the day on the 18th, Grant decided that he would no longer try to break Lee's line. He was far too strong, and he could rush troops to plug any hole that was made by an attack. Grant hoped that if he moved one of his corps away from the battlefield, that Lee would leave his entrenchments to go after it, in an attempt to defeat it while it was alone. Then, as Lee's army moved south, he could bring it to battle outside of fortifications with the other 3 corps. He chose Hancock's corps to maneuver south and try to get to the crossing of the North Anna River. Lee was unsure about Grant's next move. He wrote to President Jefferson Davis that he couldn't attack Grant with his limited resources and tired troops. Richard Ewell's corps reported that there were no Federals in their front, so Lee authorized a reconnaissance in force by Ewell's corps to gauge the disposition of the Union Army. Robert Rhodes and John B. Gordon's divisions left the flank and made their way across the Nye River. No Union forces were in their way until they got across the river. Rhodes's men were in the lead when they came into contact with Robert Tyler's division, made up of heavy artillery units given rifles to fight as infantry. Rhodes's men came into contact with the 2nd New York Heavy Artillery and the 1st Massachusetts Heavy Artillery. The Bay State Regiment divided itself into 3 battalions to engage with the rebels. The 1st Battalion was overpowered by Ramser's North Carolinians. Hoping to capitalize on his own momentum, Ramser charged the Union line, but as one Union soldier said, the firing was more than human flesh and blood could stand, and the Tar Heels fell back. Ramser would attack the position at least 2 more times, but failed each time. The rest of his division came up, giving him additional support. However, Union reinforcements were also coming to the field. John B. Gordon's division fell onto Rhodes's left flank to hold off the heavy artillery regiments, but Union 2nd Corps troops were overlapping their position. John Crocker's brigade rushed forward and sent back William Terry's Virginians. The Confederate left flank appeared to be caving in, but Gordon sent John Hoffman's brigade to shore up the flank. Darkness was now covering the battlefield, ending the fight at the Harris Farm and the entire Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse. From May 8th to the 19th, the Army of the Potomac and the Army of Northern Virginia engaged in a brutal battle that saw some of the most intense fighting of the entire American Civil War. The brutality and the near-constant battling make Spotsylvania stand out as the bloodiest battle of the Overland Campaign. Ulysses S. Grant hoped to destroy Robert E. Lee's army, but it hadn't happened. Lee held on, moving troops to fill breakthroughs and rushing reinforcements to vulnerable areas. Neither did Lee destroy Grant's army. In all reality, it was a draw, with both sides claiming victory. Lee had successfully blocked Grant from getting around his flank into Spotsylvania Courthouse, and Grant bloodied Lee's beleaguered army, inflicting more casualties that Lee couldn't replace. In the end, the Union lost 18,399 men, 2,725 killed, 13,416 wounded, and 2,258 missing and captured. The Confederacy lost 12,687 troops, 1,515 killed, 5,415 wounded, and 5,758 missing and captured. The Overland Campaign was less than 3 weeks old, but had produced over 60,000 casualties. The Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse resulted in over 30,000 casualties, but by the end, Ulysses S. Grant hadn't been able to destroy Robert E. Lee's army. During the last phase of the battle, Grant had sent Winfield Scott Hancock and his 2nd Corps away from the battlefield in an attempt to draw Lee away from his entrenchments around the courthouse and to attack Hancock. Grant planned for his other 3 corps to hit Lee out in the open if Lee went for the bait. Lee got word about Hancock's movement and did move Richard Ewell's 2nd Corps a few miles to the southeast, but hadn't gone after Hancock. Grant now decided to push south by moving Governor K. Warren's 5th Corps in the same direction of Hancock. By this point, Lee could see that Grant was making a wide swing in an attempt to get to Richmond. However, there was a problem. 2 Union Corps still faced Lee on the Spotsylvania battlefield. If Lee attempted to move south, Grant could attack his spread-out army. Lee could breathe a little easy because Richmond sent some forces north. Troops under John C. Breckinridge, fresh off their victory at the Battle of Newmarket in the Shenandoah Valley, as well as George Pickett's division, guarded the way across the North Anna River near Hanover Station. Now, Grant worried that with his army spread out, Lee could defeat him in detail. He would later write that Lee would never again have such an opportunity of dealing a heavy blow. By the afternoon of May 21st, Lee knew that the entire Union Army was on the move. Burnside's 9th Corps marched south, but they encountered Ewell's Corps. Not wanting to bring on a general engagement while the army was spread out, and unsure about the strength of the enemy in his front, Burnside countermarched back toward Spotsylvania Courthouse. Lee instructed Richard Anderson, temporarily commanding James Longstreet's corps, to march at 7 p.m. down the Telegraph Road with Ewell's Corps in front on their way to North Anna. A.P. Hill's corps left at 10 p.m. and swung farther to the west. The exhausted troops traveled through the night in an attempt to get beyond Grant's reach and to buy time for Lee to judge Grant's true intentions. By 8 a.m. on the morning of May 22nd, Lee crossed the North Anna. He had won the race. Grant and the Army of the Potomac commander George Meade discussed their next steps in the campaign. Grant had 2 options. He could swing to the east or west and force Lee to give up his defensive positions south of the river, or he could head straight for Lee. Meade, tired of the bloodshed, wanted to try the flanking maneuver, but Grant chose to adhere to his original plan that stated, "Lee's army will be your objective point. Wherever Lee goes, you will go." By the end of the day on May 22nd, the entire Union Army was on their way to the North Anna. Problems arose throughout Grant and Meade's army as they marched south. The maps that the corps commanders used were substandard, not including important locations, and the locations that were on the maps were in the wrong places. Grant passed down the orders for the army to begin marching toward Lee at 5 a.m. The early morning didn't relieve the hot summer heat. Warren and his 5th Corps ran into problems when he was ordered to cross at Jericho Bridge. He didn't see a Jericho Bridge on his map, but there was a Jericho Mills. He would find out that there was instead a ford at Jericho Mills. Warren and his aides enlisted the help of an elderly African-American man to find the ford, but he confessed that he hadn't been to it in about 50 years. By the evening of May 23rd, Grant's forces were closing in on Lee. Lee himself hadn't fortified his position yet because he feared that Grant may swing to the west or east to flank him out of his position. But the Confederate general would soon get confirmation that Grant was heading straight for him. The bloodshed over the past couple of weeks had yet to dampen the spirits of the Confederate rank and file. One soldier wrote, "I believe this campaign to be the decisive one, and know we are going to whip the detestable enemy." Another wrote, "If Grant still desires to fight, he can be accommodated, and I think with the same results as before." At the North Anna, Lee placed Anderson's corps in the center, Hill's corps on the left, and Ewell's corps on the right. Anderson, as he crossed the Chesterfield Bridge, placed John Hennigan's brigade of South Carolinians at a redoubt that guarded the bridge, then marched the rest of the corps across. Warren's 5th Corps was already crossing at the ford at Jericho Mills. Lee enlisted the help of Jedediah Hotchkiss, Stonewall Jackson's mapmaker for the Shenandoah Valley campaign, to help position his army to best take advantage of the ground on the south side of the river. Hotchkiss suggested not fortifying the location because the ground on the north side of the river was higher, which would subject the men to horrible artillery fire if they entrenched. Hancock and the 2nd Corps approached the redoubt guarded by the South Carolinians. A 100-yard open field was in front of the fortification, which the Southerners knew would allow them to rain lead into the advancing troops when the attacks began. A soldier in Hennigan's brigade recalled the scene years later. "Here we hoped the enemy would attack us. On the south side of this river, on the road leading to Hanover Station, good heavy works had been completed, while a fort of inferior proportions on the north side was intended to protect the bridge across the river from raiding parties of the enemy. To our surprise, when the part of our army that was designed to cross the river at this point had crossed over, the 3rd Regiment, James Battalion, and the 7th Regiment were left behind about this ford. We had no idea that anything serious was intended, but after a while it leaked out that General Lee needed some time to complete a line of works from one point of the river to another on the same stream, on the south side, and that it would be intended that the bare handful of men with us were intended to hold the approach to the bridge in face of the tens of thousands of Grant's army in our front. Trying to realize the task assigned us, positions were assigned the different forces with us. It was seen that the 7th Regiment, which stretched to the left of the ford, could not occupy, even by a thin line, the territory near them. We were promised the cooperation of artillery just on the other side of the river. Hancock positioned 12 artillery batteries to assist his infantry in destroying the lone Confederate brigade. Brigadier General David Birney's division was chosen to attack the redoubt. Birney's 3,000 men from Thomas Egan, Byron Pierce, and William Brewster's brigades readied themselves for the assault. Egan's troops were split, with part of them attacking down the Telegraph Road, while the others were on the extreme left flank. A mixture of Pierce and Brewster's men occupied the right, with the rest of Brewster's brigade in reserve. When the 12 batteries opened fire on the South Carolinians, it shook the ground, making the Southerners dive for cover, and also neutralized a lot of the Confederate artillery on the south side of the river. Birney attacked at 6:30 p.m. The Confederate skirmishers out front fired only a few shots before being thrown back by the approaching Federals. A member of the 124th New York remembered, "One of the most savage fires of shell and bullets I have ever experienced, but the men only rushed on all the faster. We were only a few moments crossing the flats, but left strewn along our route nearly 1/5 of the charging line." The 7th, South Carolina, broke first, with some running for the bridge and others running into the river to escape the Union bullets. With their flank gone, the rest of Hennigan's men headed for the rear. A soldier in the brigade remembered, "It was manifest now that the enemy would soon be in our rear, and as the sun was sinking to rest in the west, we made a bold dash to cross the river in our rear, bringing down upon us the enemy's artillery fire of shot and shell, as well as musketry. It looked hard to tell which way across the river was best, whether by way of the bridge or to wade across. It was said our lieutenant colonel, who was on foot when reaching the opposite bank and finding his boots full of water, said to a soldier, 'Tom, give me your hand.' 'No, no, Major,' was the reply. 'This is no time for giving hands.' The ascent of the long hill on the south side was made under heavy fire of the enemy. When at its height, a stuttering soldier proposed to a comrade to lay down and let him get behind him. Of course, the proposition was declined without thanks. When we reformed at the top of the hill, there was quite a fun of jokes told. Amongst others, the one last stated, Tom Paysinger, said, 'Nelson, if I had been there, I would have killed myself laughing,' whereupon the stutterer said, 'Tom Paysinger, I saw a heap of men down there, but not one that laughed.' War has its humorous as well as its serious side, and many a joke was cracked in battle, or if not mentioned then, the joke was told soon afterwards. It is recalled just here that in this battle an officer, who had escaped being wounded up to that time, was painfully wounded. When being borne on the way to the rear on a stretcher, he was heard to exclaim, 'Oh, that I had been a good man! Oh, that I had listened to my mother!' When he returned to the army, many a laugh was had at his expense when these expressions would be reported. But the officer got even with one of his tormentors, who was one of the bearers of the litter upon which the officer was borne away, for while this young man was at his best in imitating the words and tone of the wounded man, he was suddenly arrested by the words, 'Yes, I remember when a shell burst pretty close, you forgot me, and dropped your end of the litter.' The laugh was turned. All this, however, was in perfect good humor. With Hennigan's brigade now pushed over the river, Hancock's 2nd Corps troops began moving across. Now, Lee would need to contend with 2 Union corps across the North Anna, Hancock, and Warren on the far left. As Winfield Scott Hancock and his 2nd Corps was pushing away Hennigan's brigade at the Chesterfield Bridge, Governor K. Warren's 5th Corps was battling with Cadmus Wilcox's division of A.P. Hill's corps upriver. Warren, unlike his earlier actions at the Wilderness and Spotsylvania courthouse, took the initiative and pushed his men across the river at Jericho Mills. It wasn't a deep river, being about 150 feet wide and 4 feet deep, but the banks were high, so he immediately got his engineers constructing a bridge, but he couldn't wait for them to finish. He needed to get across the river. Charles Griffin's division got across first, establishing a beachhead on the other side of the river, and that allowed the other divisions in Warren's corps to cross. Soon the majority of the corps was across. Approaching their position was the division of Cadmus Wilcox. Rooney Lee, Robert E. Lee's son, and a cavalry division commander notified Wilcox that it was just cavalry in his front and that it would be easy to throw them back. Wilcox advanced toward the river, expecting to encounter some dismounted cavalry, but ran into most of Warren's corps. Griffin's division and part of Samuel Crawford's were in position to throw back an enemy attack, but Lysander Cutler's division had just crossed the river when the attack was commencing. Wilcox positioned William Pegram's artillery on the Confederate right to hold Crawford's men in place while he attacked them in front. The artillery battered the blue troops, preventing their movement, and many shells were fired closer to the river to prevent reinforcements from coming up. When Wilcox's men hit the Union line, it overlapped Warren's flank. The murderous fire from Joseph Brown's South Carolinians and Edward Thomas's Georgians sent the Iron Brigade to the rear, except for the tenacious 6th Wisconsin, who remained at the front. Cutler's other brigades, of J. William Hoffman and Edward Bragg, came up to stem the tide of the approaching rebels, but Wilcox's brigade leveled their rifled muskets and threw disastrous volleys into their ranks, sending Bragg's troops into a retreat just like the Iron Brigade. Warren's corps was under serious threat of being driven back toward the river. However, Wilcox's success would also lead to his failure. Like with any successful attack, cohesion began to break down. Thomas continued forward, but the 6th Wisconsin fired into his flank. This unexpected volley stunned Thomas's rightmost regiments, sending them to the rear, leaving Thomas with only 2 regiments, the 14th and 45th Georgia, to continue the assault. The success also produced a gap between James Lane's North Carolinians and Joseph Brown's South Carolinians. The gap was so large that Lane believed Brown had fallen back. It was only when Wilcox assured him that their comrades were indeed still fighting that Lane continued the attack. Despite the problems, Brown pushed back the 6th Wisconsin and part of Jacob Schweitzer's brigade, but Warren was quickly rushing reinforcements to the scene. Joseph Bartlett's brigade surged forward, which knocked back Brown's brigade and what was left of Thomas's Georgians. Hoffman's brigade saw an opportunity with Alfred Scales' brigade left alone on the flank. Hoffman charged forward, driving Scales away and securing the beachhead for the Union. The battle in that sector was over, and Warren was able to avoid disaster and act quickly to seal the breakthrough. Despite being heavily outnumbered, Wilcox had nearly routed an entire corps with a single division. Robert E. Lee was mad. He came up to A.P. Hill and asked, "General Hill, why did you let those people cross here? Why didn't you throw your whole force on them and drive them back as Jackson would have done?" Hill remained silent during the reprimand. Wilcox and Henry Heath pulled their divisions back to a strong line that Lee assembled, despite a salient being present. The engineer in Lee and the suggestions by his subordinates helped to create a great defensive line with interior lines and a great reserve. Hill's corps stretched from the North Anna to the Little River on the Confederate left. Richard Anderson's corps occupied the center, with George Pickett and John Breckinridge's divisions in reserve. Richard Ewell's corps was on the left. His front and flank was protected by a swampy area. With Grant's troops coming across the river, Lee's defensive line denied the Union commander interior lines. If Grant wanted to reinforce either flank or need to seal a breakthrough, his men would have to cross the North Anna 2 times. Night came and the morning brought orders for more attacks. Ambrose Burnside was to move part of his 9th Corps across the North Anna at Ox Ford and the other half at Quarles Mill. On the morning of May 24th, 2 regiments from Orlando Wilcox's division approached the river and made it to an island in the middle of the waterway. Developments on the eastern end of the battlefield caused Burnside to halt his men and ordered them not to continue crossing. Part of Crittenden's division made it across at Quarles Mill with the help of Crawford's division from Warren's 5th Corps. James Ledley's brigade forded the river at 2 p.m., raising their weapons, cartridge boxes, and cap boxes over their heads. They moved out from the beachhead toward the Confederate entrenchments. The brigade quickly pushed back the rebel skirmish line. Ledley asked his division commander, Thomas Crittenden, for more troops, but he had none to spare and none on hand to quickly support him, so he ordered Ledley to halt and not attack. Ledley, as one historian said, was filled with liquor and ambition and decided to attack anyway. The men charged the Confederate line and immediately came under a withering hail of musketry and artillery shells. The front line fell back, and the second line surged forward only to be met with the same fate. Some of the rebels came out of their breastworks to chase after the Federals and cleared their front of the enemy. Ledlie lost 450 men, or a third of his brigade, in the futile attack. While Ledlie's men attacked, Warren moved his corps to Knoll Station on the Virginia Central Railroad, and Horatio Wright's corps took the place of Warren's men across from Jericho Mills. Hancock was moving his divisions and brigades across the Chesterfield Bridge, attempting to shore up his lines. Hancock didn't know exactly where Robert E. Lee's lines were, so he ordered Division Commander Francis Barlow to probe south along the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac Railroad. Barlow chose Thomas Smith and his brigade to reconnoiter the front, and as they pressed south, they came into contact with Confederate skirmishers. They knew the main line wouldn't be far away and swept the skirmishers aside and came into contact with part of Charles Field and Robert Rhodes's divisions. Smith bolstered his line with other troops from the brigade, but knew he couldn't push the enemy from their position. Later, Barlow sent John Brooks' brigade to stabilize Smith's right flank, but realized the heavily entrenched rebels were too much for his two brigades and called off any attack. By that evening, Grant knew he needed to change strategy. He ordered Warren to test the Confederate line in his front, and after some probing, Warren reported that, "I feel satisfied that I should have great difficulty at best in whipping the enemy in my front." Grant and Meade held a council of war to decide what to do next. Some officers suggested moving to the east, keeping in constant communication with Washington and their supply base. Others thought they should move to Lee's left and push on from Richmond from the northwest. Grant decided on that strategy, but the next day reversed his decision. They would move east and swing around Lee's right flank. The Battle of North Anna was over. The Union lost 3,986 total, 591 killed, 2,734 wounded, and 661 captured or missing. The Confederacy lost 1,552 total, 124 killed, 704 wounded, and 724 missing or captured. It wasn't the deadliest battle of the Overland Campaign, but demonstrated Robert E. Lee's tactical and strategic skills and Ulysses S. Grant's determination to get Lee away from their entrenched areas and out into the open. On May 26, Ulysses S. Grant wrote to Washington saying, "Lee's army is really whipped. The prisoners we now take show it." Grant may not have been able to give Robert E. Lee a decisive defeat, but the constant combat was wearing on the Confederate army. Although some remained hopeful, many were leaving the rebel ranks, and Grant saw this dispirited nature as a victory. On May 27th, in the early morning hours, the Army of the Potomac began to move out from their positions at the North Anna River. The 5th and 9th Corps swung farther to the east and south than the 2nd and 6th Corps, which remained closer to the Pamunkey River. Lee wasn't taken by surprise. He figured that Grant would be on the move, but he didn't know where. By 6 a.m., the Confederate general knew he needed to move either way. His cavalry was already patrolling the river crossings, and part was combating Union cavalry to the west. The Army of Northern Virginia was quickly on the move to counter Grant's movements. Richard Ewell's corps followed close to the river, while Richard Anderson's corps followed the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac Railroad south. A.P. Hill's corps remained on the North Anna battlefield until all Union threats were gone from the area. Then it followed behind Anderson's corps down the railroad. Grant needed to secure a way across the Pamunkey River, and his cavalry probed the major river crossings. At Dabney's Ferry, Union Brigadier General Alfred Torbert's cavalry division encountered cavalry from a brigade in Rooney Lee's division. The 5th, 2nd, and 1st North Carolina Cavalry began to throw up breastworks to block the Union cavalry advance, while the 3rd North Carolina Cavalry moved down the road to reconnoiter the ground. The 1st and 6th Michigan pushed back the Tar Heels, chasing them to the breastworks. There, a firefight broke out between the Cavaliers. The other Michiganders, under George Armstrong Custer, made their way to Salem Church. Torbert wanted to flank the North Carolinians out of their position. Rooney Lee thought the same thing about the Michiganders in his front. As the Marylanders went down the road to find the Union flank, they ran into the rest of Custer's troops. The fight ended quickly when Custer ordered a charge and sent the Marylanders into a retreat. With their flank under threat, the Confederate cavalry had no other option than to withdraw. Meanwhile, Robert E. Lee was positioning his army to combat Grant's flanking maneuver, but he needed additional information. So he sent Wade Hampton and 4,500 horsemen on a reconnaissance mission toward the crossings of the Pamunkey River. The fight on the previous day, on May 27th, convinced Grant that he could cross at Dabney Ferry and Nelson's Bridge, and the Union cavalry now across the river were to secure the territory around the crossings. On the morning of May 28th, the two cavalry forces met, Confederate cavalry under Hampton and the Union cavalry under David M. Gregg near Hawes Shop. The 10th New York Cavalry, reconnoitering in front of the Union position, were charged by the 2nd Virginia Cavalry, sending some of the New Yorkers scampering to the rear, but Henry Davies sent the 1st Pennsylvania Cavalry to beat back the Virginians. While that back and forth took place, Gregg reinforced his own line. The rebel horsemen were dismounted and threw up a line of breastworks to guard their position. Heavy skirmishing took place between the lines, but no major attack was made. Hampton sent in some South Carolina cavalry to bolster his line. One New Yorker commented on the fighting erupting in his front. He said, "It was at times the hottest place I was ever in. Never did I encounter in so short a space of time so much of desperate fighting." By this time, Philip Sheridan, Union cavalry commander, was rushing troops to the scene of the fight. The 1st New Jersey and 1st Pennsylvania attacked the rebel line and broke it where the 3rd Virginia was defending it. The Federal horsemen mounted a devastating attack, but the 20th Georgia Battalion plugged the hole. It was now around 5 p.m., and Rooney Lee was watching the Confederate left and became convinced that Chambliss couldn't hold out and that he was vastly outnumbered, and asked Hampton for permission to withdraw. Hampton granted it, and Chambliss pulled back, exposing Thomas Rosser's left flank. This move produced horrible repercussions. The 17th and 6th Pennsylvania, along with the 19th New York, swung around Rosser's flank and delivered deadly volleys into the Confederate flank. Rosser had no other option than to fall back. Custer, with his men now making up the front line, was in a heavy firefight, but he heard the gunfire increase on his right, which signaled that his comrades were making a significant attack, so he ordered his men to charge the position, breaking the Confederate line. Hampton and his horsemen were in full retreat by 6 p.m. Ultimately, at Hawes Shop, both sides lost under 400 men each, but it was a humiliating defeat for the Confederate cavalry, and only secured the crossings along the Pamunkey River for Grant, George Meade, and the Army of the Potomac. After the Battle of Hawes Shop, Ulysses S. Grant moved his army across the Pamunkey River. Once across the river, Grant wasn't sure where Robert E. Lee's army was. Likewise, Lee was void of information about the Union Army's movements. Union General Philip Sheridan and his cavalry were exhausted from their fight with Confederate cavalry and their raid, so Grant allowed them to rest behind the lines, which deprived the Army of the Potomac of its eyes and ears. Army Commander George Meade had no choice but to send out infantry in force to ascertain the whereabouts of Lee's army. A division from the 2nd, 5th, and 6th Corps moved out to find the Confederate Army. The 6th Corps division headed north, while the other two divisions ran into parts of Lee's army. Light skirmishing broke out along the line, but now Grant knew where Lee's army was positioned. The Army of the Potomac moved out of its defensive line and toward the Army of Northern Virginia. Lee himself was worried about the roads leading to Richmond from the east of his position, and sent some of his cavalry to Old Church. Union Corps Commander Governor K. Warren was worried about that cavalry on his left flank and rear, and begged Sheridan to clear his flank. After repeated pleading, Sheridan finally moved out to combat the rebel cavalry, sending Alfred Torbert's division to deal with the rebels under Matthew Butler. The Confederate horsemen moved north and came into contact with the 17th Pennsylvania Cavalry of Thomas Devon's brigade. As the two sides engaged, more cavalry entered the fight, throwing volleys at one another from across a creek south of Old Church. The 17th Pennsylvania withdrew to replenish their cartridge boxes, and the 2nd U.S. Cavalry took their place. Repeated attempts to dislodge the South Carolinians ended in failure. While the battle raged, George Armstrong Custer's cavalry brigade made it to the field and added weight to the Union battle line. With the firing intensifying and Union troops overlapping their flanks, the rebels retreated. The 7th South Carolina and the 20th Georgia Cavalry Battalion attempted to hinder the Federal troops, but couldn't withstand the firepower of the repeating rifles possessed by the enemy. Robert E. Lee wasn't willing to give up the avenues into Richmond so easily. Plus, he now knew that Warren's 5th Corps was isolated and could be defeated in detail. Lee maneuvered Richard Ewell's corps, now under Jubal Early since Ewell was ill, toward the Bethesda Church. Samuel Crawford's Union Division occupied the area just around the church. The divisions of Robert Rhodes, Stephen Ramseur, and George Pickett approached the church on May 30th. Brian Grimes' brigade arrived first and attacked Martin Hardin's brigade. Hardin was inexperienced in command, and when the North Carolinians under Grimes assaulted their position, they and Kitching's brigade retreated to a safe location along the Shady Grove Road. At this point, Early halted any advance until the rest of his force could concentrate. Unfortunately for Early, this gave Warren enough time to rush troops to the scene of battle. When Early was ready to attack, elements of 3 Union divisions were on the field. Light skirmishing occurred along the whole line, and the only major attack that took place was when new division commander Stephen Ramseur got his blood up and wanted to attack the Federal line, sending John Pegram's brigade against the Union breastworks. Some of the soldiers remembered, "At each successful fire, great gaps were made in our ranks, but immediately closed up, and our line melted away as if by magic. Every brigade, staff, and field officer was cut down in an incredibly short time." A Union soldier remembered, "The slaughter was so sickening that Major Hartshorn leaped to his feet and called upon his assailants to surrender. Some hundreds did so. Rebels or no rebels, their behavior and bearing during the charge had won the admiration of their captors, who did not hesitate to express it." The brigade withdrew, and the fight around Bethesda Church was over. The Union lost 731 total, 679 killed and wounded, and 52 captured. The Confederacy lost 1,593 total, 263 killed, 961 wounded, and 369 missing or captured. Lee, Grant, and Meade now skirmished with one another to find out where the battle lines were. Both armies were also getting reinforcements. Confederate General Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard sent Robert Hoke's division from his standoff with Benjamin Butler and his Army of the James at Bermuda Hundred, south of Richmond. Likewise, Butler sent the 18th Army Corps under William Baldy Smith from his Army of the James to Grant's assistance. Smith's corps was at White House, and the information given to Lee about the newly arrived corps led the Confederate Army commander to fear for his right flank. Cold Harbor was a vital crossroads that, if taken by Union forces, would allow Meade and Grant to outflank him and threaten Richmond. To capture the location, Lee sent Hoke's newly arrived division to secure the location and pulled Anderson's corps out of his entrenchments. Then the entire corps headed east to support Hoke's hold on Cold Harbor. Grant and Meade saw the movement of troops to Cold Harbor and pulled Horatio Wright's 6th Corps out of line and ordered it to march to Cold Harbor. Smith and the 18th Army Corps was to move onto Wright's right flank and connect with Warren's 5th Corps, but Smith was told he needed to march to Newcastle Ferry, which was in the wrong direction. Wright's Corps began their march a little late, with the last division not leaving until 4:30 a.m. on June 1st. Only the cavalry division of Alfred Torbert occupied the crossroads at Old Cold Harbor. Kershaw and Hoke's division were between Old and New Cold Harbor. Awaiting them was George Armstrong Custer's brigade and Wesley Merritt's brigade. The inexperienced Lawrence Kite, taken over the brigade formerly under John Hennigan, launched his brigade against the Cavaliers without sending out skirmishers, and the results were horrendous, with the South Carolinians taking heavy casualties and Kite himself being mortally wounded. By the time Kershaw reformed Kite's brigade, elements of Horatio Wright's 6th Corps was on the field, securing the Union's hold on the vital crossroads. The campaign would now shift to the south and east, as both Lee and Grant battled over Cold Harbor and the territory to its north. With Union forces moving toward Cold Harbor, the battle lines for the Union Army of the Potomac and the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia began to shift. William Baldy Smith and his 18th Corps and Horatio Wright and his 6th Corps were on the far Union left. Ulysses S. Grant and George Meade wanted to mount an offensive in the Cold Harbor area, so they wanted demonstrations made by the other corps commanders to distract Lee and maybe relieve pressure that might be coming toward Wright and Smith. Governor K. Warren, commanding the 5th Corps, was ordered to demonstrate in his front, but he was unwilling to do so. So Meade called on Winfield Scott Hancock and the 2nd Corps to push in the enemy pickets. The assault plan for Wright and Smith's troops was scheduled for 6 p.m. on June 1st. Meade placed Wright in charge of the attack, even though Smith outranked him, and Wright didn't have experience in such large operations. 4 infantry divisions would be used to attack the Confederate flank, 20,000 blue-coated soldiers. The Confederates numbered around 10,000, but they were behind breastworks. Prior to the attack, Robert Hoke, fearing for the safety of his right flank, moved Hagood's brigade from the position on his left to his right flank. This was a wise move because the 6th Corps troops overlapped his flank, but he didn't notify any of his superiors about the movement, which resulted in a gap between his division and Kershaw's division. Instead of attacking as one mass, the Union brigades went in piecemeal. The division of David Russell went in first. Part of William Penrose's New Jersey brigade began the assault. The men from New Jersey were decimated by small arms fire and canister when they advanced. They couldn't withstand the shelling for long and fell back to the rear. Penrose wouldn't be outdone and formed up 2 more regiments to feed into the attack. They stepped off into the den of death and became pinned down about 50 yards from the Confederate works. The Union men dug feverishly to pile up any amount of dirt to protect themselves from the projectiles. Next, Nelson Cross's brigade, backed up by 2 regiments of Vermonters from Lewis Grant's brigade, attacked next. Just like Penrose's men, the attack ground to a halt as artillery shells, canister, and musketry ripped holes in their lines. Many of the men retreated in haste, while others attempted to remain on the front and dig small rifle pits to protect themselves. To the north, Emory Upton, the man who broke the Confederate line at the Mule Shoe on the Spotsylvania battlefield, was forming his men for his own attack. Remembering how he did so well by stacking his regiments, he made 4 lines of men, about 500 men in each line. The first 3 were made up of the 2nd Connecticut Heavy Artillery. The last line was made up of the rest of his regiments. As soon as they stepped off, flanking fire came in on their left. Hoke's division had cut down trees to funnel the men into a few locations, which allowed them to practice their musketry with devastating results. Upton ordered his men to lay down. Henry Eustis was ill and his brigade wasn't moving to support Upton's attack. Russell, angry at the lack of movement, took charge of the brigade and led it forward. The division commander received a nasty arm wound in the attack, and the rebel resistance proved too much for Eustis's brigade, which fell back to their stepping-off point. William Truex's brigade was the next Union brigade to begin their movement against the Confederate line. Fortunately for them, Hagood's movement created a gap in the Confederate line, and Truex's men occupied the abandoned works and went into the rear of the Confederate line. Wofford's attention was distracted by Benjamin Smith's approaching line, so Truex made it through the lines without much damage. However, once they were behind the Confederate lines, the 8th North Carolina turned to face them and delivered some deadly volleys into their ranks. Truex's men were undeterred by the rifle fire and sent it right back into the Tar Heels. The 8th broke, and the 51st North Carolina, the next ones in line, turned to face the threat. By this time, Truex's men were in disarray, being behind the lines and getting fired at by Thomas Clingman's troops and a few soldiers from William Wofford's brigade. However, the tenacious Upton reformed his ranks and put pressure on Clingman's front, keeping the Confederate brigade commander from dispatching troops to his left. On the Union right, the divisions of Charles Devens and William Brooks of William Baldry Smith's 18th Corps advanced in a more coordinated effort against the Confederate line. The pressure against Wofford, Goodbrine, and Clingman caused the line to collapse as a direct result of the breakthrough where Hoke removed Hagood's brigade. A few rebels fired their weapons as they retreated from their positions, which slowed down the Union troops but didn't stop them. Alfred Colquitt sent the 28th and part of the 23rd and 27th Georgia to hit the Yankees in the left flank, while Joseph Kershaw pulled the 2nd South Carolina and the 3rd South Carolina Battalion from Hennigan's brigade and sent them to hit the blue troops in the right flank. It was getting dark on that June 1st evening, and the darkness, along with the few regiments thrown onto the flanks of the Union soldiers in the breakthrough, caused the blue troops to move back to their original battle lines. Darkness had saved Robert E. Lee's army from disaster. The attacks on the Confederate right looked promising to Grant and Meade, so they wanted to shift more troops into that sector in order to break Lee's lines and have a road all the way to Richmond. Grant pulled the 2nd Corps out of its entrenchments and ordered it to the left of the line. He wanted Winfield Scott Hancock and the 2nd Corps to be ready to support a 6 a.m. assault in that sector by Wright and Smith. Lee saw that Hancock was now gone and pulled part of A.P. Hill's corps away from the left and moved them to the Confederate right, which only left Henry Heath's division of Hill's corps on the left. In addition to Hancock moving to the Union left, Ambrose Burnside and his 9th Corps moved behind Warren's 5th Corps. When Smith informed Grant and Meade that he was in need of ammunition, the 6 a.m. attack was delayed until 5 p.m. on June 2nd, but it would ultimately be delayed again until the morning of June 3rd. While the Union Army was shifting, Lee wanted to take advantage of the situation. He saw an opportunity to deal a blow to Grant when Burnside removed his corps. However, not all of Burnside's corps had gone from the Union right. Lee wanted Jubal Early to fall on the Union right flank and cause as much damage as possible. Early's troops again headed for the area around the Bethesda Church, where the division of Thomas Crittenden and Charles Griffin were stationed. Robert Rhodes's division hit the Union brigades first, with 2 brigades from Crittenden's division occupying the Shady Grove Road. The 2 Union brigades attempted to hold out, but for an unknown reason, Joseph Sudsberg's brigade advanced toward the rebel division. The blue-coated soldiers were heavily outnumbered, and the musketry ripped their line to shreds, sending them and Elisha Marshall back toward the church. Henry Heath's division was advancing around the same time as Rhodes was pushing away Sudsberg and Marshall. It was getting late in the evening, and the stiff resistance put up by Simon Griffin's brigade stalled Heath's attack. To the west, John B. Gordon's division overlapped 2 brigades from Griffin's division. Despite the darkness beginning to cover the field, Gordon pressed his men, who sent Griffin's men running toward the Bethesda Church. Fortunately for the Union, artillery covered the area around the church and the Tinsley House. In the words of one Union soldier, the whole thing was miserably mismanaged. Robert E. Lee moved most of A.P. Hill's corps to the Confederate right when he saw Ulysses S. Grant move Winfield Scott Hancock's corps. Along with Hill's troops came soldiers commanded by former Vice President of the United States, John C. Breckinridge. Breckinridge spent most of the war in the Western Theater, but came east and was now operating in the Army of Northern Virginia, starting with the Battle of North Anna. Grant planned for an early morning attack to take place on June 3rd. Hancock's corps would make the attack at 4:30 a.m. The 2nd Corps commander organized his 3 divisions for the assault, with Francis Barlow and John Gibbon's divisions in front and David Birney's division in support. A light rain dropped on the Federal soldiers, similar to their attack on the Muleshoe on the Spotsylvania battlefield less than a month earlier. They would face 4 Confederate divisions. Troops under Robert Hoke, John C. Breckinridge, and Cadmus Wilcox made up the front line, while William Mahone's division remained in reserve. It was a strong line, and those rebel divisions had 12 hours to improve their positions by throwing up breastworks and digging in. At 4:30 a.m., a single gun broke the silence of the morning. The shot rang out from a cannon of the 10th Massachusetts Artillery. That was the signal for the Union soldiers to advance. They moved across the open ground in front of the rebel works. A Union artilleryman remembered the assault as simply terrific. It had the fury of the Wilderness musketry with the thunders of the Gettysburg artillery superadded. The men in John Eccles' brigade were in a muddy mess within their breastworks, and the rain only made it worse, so their commander pulled them back a little distance to get to some higher ground. But this exposed a weak point in the Confederate line, just as the massive Union assault was taking place. The 7th New York Heavy Artillery, now turned infantry, took the initiative and pushed back Eccles' brigade. The rest of John Brooks' brigade was behind them, but the withering fire from the Confederate muskets forced many of them to lie down in a ditch. But the 5th New Hampshire continued on and wheeled into the opening created by Eccles' retreat. When they entered the works, the Confederates on either side of them began peppering their flanks with rifle fire, causing great disorder. William Mahone's division sat in reserve, and when the breakthrough took place, Mahone sent Joseph Finnegan's brigade of Floridians and the 2nd Maryland Battalion from Breckinridge's division into the breach. The New Yorkers and men from New Hampshire had no choice but to leave the Confederate entrenchments, knowing that they couldn't survive alone without support. A soldier from the Granite State remembered, "I found the enemy had a second line, and as my losses up to this time had been very light, I moved up to attack the second line, and then ascertained that the other regiments of the brigade had not carried the enemy's works, and that part of the 4th Brigade, which went over on our right, was obliged to retire, and the 5th Regiment was between the enemy's lines with no connection on either flank, and immediately ascertaining that no supports were in sight, gave the order to withdraw." After the repulse of the 7th New York Heavy Artillery, John Gibbon's division moved forward. They were delayed because Joshua Owen, one of Gibbon's troublesome brigade commanders, was nowhere to be found, including the brigade of soldiers. They were all still asleep, so this delayed the attack about 15 minutes, precious minutes to the troops on their left. The ground over which Gibbon's men moved hadn't been reconnoitered. In fact, none of the ground had been reconnoitered in the 2nd Corps' front. This was a mistake and a blemish on Hancock's record. Part of David Russell's division of the 6th Corps lay in Gibbon's way. Gibbon's 2 brigades moved closer to the Confederate line. and the 8th New York Heavy Artillery approached the Confederate position and received devastating volleys from Hoke's troops. One soldier in Penrose's brigade remembered, "These men were in bright new uniforms and went into the fight with their knapsacks on. It was the most sickening sight of the war." Penrose and Cross were supposed to advance with Tyler, but when they saw the slaughter of the heavy artillery, they remained where they were and dug in. The heavies hugged the ground and began to dig in, unable to move for the next 16 hours. Smith's brigade didn't fare any better. Once the musketry began to rip through their ranks, they hugged the ground too and began to entrench, piling any amount of dirt possible to conceal themselves. Joshua Owen and Henry McKean's brigades were ordered in, but the artillery and musketry was too destructive, and they advanced a little ways and then began to dig in. Hancock's men had advanced into the open fields to attack the Confederate works and been met with destruction. To the north, Horatio Wright's 6th Corps was to attack around the same time as Hancock. Parts of the brigades and divisions moved forward, but the artillery and rifle fire became too much for them. Some men had been so badly bloodied from the fight on June 1st that they simply remained in their hastily made entrenchments. A soldier who did advance toward the rebel works remembered, "We never even reached the enemy's works. We advanced under a murderous fire in our front from the enemy's artillery and sharpshooters when in range of its main line of battle, and were simply slaughtered." The sporadic and uncoordinated movements of the 6th Corps produced no results, and most of the men withdrew to safety. The half-hearted attempts at attacking the Confederate works didn't relieve pressure on Hancock's troops, and it didn't inspire confidence in William Baldy Smith's 18th Corps, which was also attacking the Confederate works, right alongside the 6th and 2nd Corps. 3 of Smith's brigades stepped off in an assault, but were quickly either pinned down or thinned so badly that the units couldn't make any kind of stand against the rebels. One man remembered, in less than 10 minutes from the word forward, there was no brigade to be seen, and of its leading regiment, nearly one half lay dead or disabled on the field, while the remaining scattered ones, 2 at least out of every 10, were more or less severely wounded. Guy Henry's brigade attacked as the others were falling back, but once he saw the desperate situation, the attack ground to a halt, and the men either ran back to their lines or laid on the ground searching for cover. Soon word came to Meade that the attacks had stalled out, and the men were digging in rather than attacking. At 7 a.m., Meade sought the advice of Grant. Grant responded, "The moment it becomes certain an assault cannot succeed, suspend the offensive. But when one does succeed, push it vigorously, and if necessary, pile in troops at that successful point from wherever they can be taken." On the north end of the Union line, Burnside launched a small attack of his own, but the attack fizzled out when the Confederate line in that sector appeared too strong. Back on Hancock's front, Finnegan's Floridians and James Martin's North Carolinians were uneasy with the Federal troops dug in so close to their lines and wanted to send them back, so they launched a counterattack on the evening of June 3rd. Both brigades were riddled with bullets as they attempted to confront the Federal soldiers, who were unwilling to give up the ground so easily. The rebels fell back to their entrenchments. Within a short time on the morning of June 3rd, 3,500 Union soldiers fell in the disastrous assaults. Meade sought input from his corps commanders about another possible offensive. Hancock responded, "I am averse to an assault simply because my men have been so constantly out at the front, lying in the trenches all the time for 3 days, and are so fatigued that I fear they have not the dash necessary to carry through the obstacles of a second line. They have lost the officers who have been accustomed to lead them, and the obstacles are materially greater than they were on the first day." Other small attacks would occur, but nothing substantial after the massive assaults on June 3rd. The Union lost 12,737 total, 1,844 killed, 9,077 wounded, and 1,816 missing and captured. The Confederacy lost 4,595, 83 killed, 3,380 wounded, and 1,132 missing and captured. A Union surgeon described the Overland Campaign as, "It has been fight, fight, fight. Every day there is a fight, and every day the hospital is again filled." 2 more cavalry battles would mark the Overland Campaign, the Battle of Trevelyan Station and the Battle of St. Mary's Church. Both of them produced results for the Union and the Confederacy. At Trevelyan Station, Philip Sheridan was able to destroy some of the Virginia Central Railroad, but Wade Hampton inflicted more casualties on the Union Cavalier and halted the raid. At St. Mary's Church, Confederate cavalry outnumbered their Union counterpart guarding the wagon train, but was unable to destroy the supplies. With the end of those two battles, the Overland Campaign came to an end. Lee had countered every move that Grant made, but Grant kept maneuvering his army toward Richmond. By Cold Harbor, he was incredibly close to the capital. From the Wilderness to Spotsylvania Courthouse to North Anna and Cold Harbor, both armies suffered immense casualties and left bodies strewn across the Virginia countryside. The numbers vary from historian to historian, but Gordon Ray, in his book In the Footsteps of Grant and Lee, estimates that Grant lost 55,000 men, or 45% of his army, and Lee lost about 33,000 troops, or 50% of his army during the Overland Campaign. Total, nearly 90,000 men became casualties of war in a little over a month's time. This demonstrates two things: Lee's tactical ability to counter a superior force, and Grant's tenacity to push Lee to his limits. Previous to Grant, the other Union commanders were too timid to take on Lee, but through this bloody trial, Grant found out that Lee was not like the Confederate commanders that he had dealt with in the West. After Cold Harbor, during Grant's next phase, the Army of the Potomac would cross the James River and strike for Petersburg and lay siege to that city and Richmond.